Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories, where the stories get quieter, the mysteries get older, and tonight we step carefully toward one of the strangest legends ever attached to the American West. Our subject is the forbidden caves of the Grand Canyon, and more specifically the old claim that something impossible was found inside them. Not just bones, not just tools, not just the ordinary kinds of discoveries that already make archaeologists sit up straighter in their chairs, but objects so unexpected that the story has kept people arguing for more than a century. So before we get into hidden chambers, missing evidence, official denials, and the kind of rumour that never seems to grow tired, let me ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it in your part of the world? It feels only fair to ask, because stories like this always seem to arrive late in the evening, when the mind is a little softer, and a cliff face full of shadows starts to look like it might be hiding one more doorway than daylight would allow. And if you find this soothing, or interesting, or simply a pleasant place to let your thoughts slow down for a while, I'd be very grateful if you liked the video, maybe subscribed, and stayed with me for the rest of this quiet little expedition. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let's walk toward the canyon. The Grand Canyon is already the kind of place that makes ordinary language feel a bit underpowered. People go there expecting a view, and come back talking as if they briefly met geology in person. It is so large that distance stops behaving properly. Ridges look close and are not. Shadows arrive early. Light moves across the walls in a way that makes the rock seem less like scenery, and more like a stacked record of vanished worlds. This is one of the reasons stories attach themselves to the canyon so easily. A place that enormous practically invites speculation. It has depth, danger, silence, inaccessible ledges, hidden side canyons, caves, springs, old trails, older ruins, and a long human history that did not begin when tourists started pointing cameras at it. Even without any wild claims, it is already the sort of landscape that makes people feel there must be more going on than they can see from the rim. And to be fair, there often is more going on than the casual visitor sees. Grand Canyon caves are real. The National Park Service says the park contains cave and karst systems that are fragile, scientifically important, and currently closed to visitation, except for research purposes. It also notes that Grand Canyon caves have yielded mineral formations, fossil bones of extinct animals, and prehistoric artifacts, which means the idea that caves in the canyon can hold important material is not fantasy at all. The official closure exists precisely because those spaces are vulnerable and significant. In other words, the canyon does not need invented mystery in order to contain real mystery. That is where this story gets its grip, because once you know there really are caves, and once you know many of them are not open to casual visitors, the human brain does what it has always done with closed doors. It starts furnishing the room behind them. Not carefully, of course, not modestly. It does not imagine a few pottery fragments and then call it a night. It imagines statues. It imagines tunnels. It imagines lost peoples, vanished books, forbidden maps, hidden chambers, old institutions quietly moving crates in the dark, and a ranger somewhere saying, "No, you definitely cannot go in there," which for many people is the fastest possible way to make a place interesting. Tell someone a cave is closed for preservation, and they may nod politely. Tell them a cave is closed and possibly tied to a buried civilization, and suddenly they are emotionally ready to rappel down a cliff with a flashlight from a hardware store and a very unrealistic attitude. The best-known version of this legend can be traced to a front-page Arizona Gazette story published on April 5, 1909. That article claimed a vast cave complex had been found high in the Grand Canyon and described extraordinary contents, including mummies, inscriptions, and artifacts said to suggest an Egyptian or Oriental connection. It also claimed Smithsonian involvement. More than a century later, the Smithsonian's own published myth-busting page says it did not discover Egyptian ruins in the Grand Canyon, and the Pima County Public Library likewise summarizes the story as false. noting that the rumour dates back to that 1909 newspaper article and continues to be repeated. Now, right away, that creates the mood we need for tonight, because this is not merely a cave story. It is a cave story with paperwork problems. It arrives in print with the confidence of a man who has already chosen his own museum plaque. It names names. It suggests institutions. It offers details. It behaves not like a whisper, but like a report. And that matters, because people are usually more suspicious of a rumour that arrives breathlessly from a cousin's friend than one that arrives in typeset columns wearing a serious expression. Put something in a newspaper, especially in the early 20th century, and it instantly gains a certain stiffness of collar. It sits up straighter. It sounds documented, even when it is not. And this is where we need to slow down, because the emotional power of the legend depends on a very specific tension. On one side, the story sounds outrageous. Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon, a hidden underground complex in Arizona, a secret that should have changed North American history. It sounds like the sort of thing a novelist would pitch after too much coffee. But on the other side, the setting sounds plausible enough to keep the door open a crack. A cave in a canyon wall, a remote location, a dangerous ledge, restricted access. Maybe a vanished route. Maybe a find that was never properly shared. Maybe a file misplaced. Maybe a name recorded oddly. Maybe a photograph sitting in some forgotten box. This is how enduring legends survive. They wrap a wild centre in a believable border. The canyon helps with that, of course. If somebody claimed to have found a lost underground city beneath a supermarket parking lot, the story would struggle. But the Grand Canyon is built for scale, concealment, and difficult access. There are places in it that can humble experienced hikers, and there are areas where a small error stops being small very quickly. Distance behaves strangely there. Elevation behaves rudely there. Even official trail information can read like a calm but firm reminder that nature will not be negotiating today. So when a legend says the cave was high on a cliff, hard to reach, and hidden from ordinary eyes, it is borrowing credibility from a landscape that already specializes in being bigger, steeper, and less cooperative than people expect. That does not make the legend true, it just makes it durable. Another reason it lasts is that it offers two pleasures at once, and human beings are greedy when a story can provide both. First, it gives the pleasure of discovery. There is a hidden place. Someone found it. Something astonishing was inside. That is one of the oldest narrative engines we have. Second, it gives the pleasure of suppression. The truth perhaps was covered up. Authorities denied it. Institutions erased it. Maps were altered. Access was restricted. Records went missing. Whether or not any of that happened in reality, the structure is irresistible. It allows the listener to feel both wonder and suspicion. One says, "Imagine what they found." The other says, "Imagine why they hid it." Put those together and you can keep a story alive for generations. Official sources push back very plainly. The Smithsonian says the story about its discovering Egyptian ruins in the Grand Canyon is a myth, and its 2024 explanation notes that the report came from a single newspaper and continues to spread despite lacking evidence. The Pima County Public Library says much the same in a more concise form. The rumour comes from the 1909 Arizona Gazette story. The supposed Smithsonian-backed expedition did not happen, and the tale is not true. Those are not coy responses, they are direct ones. Still, direct answers do not always kill a legend. Sometimes they feed it. For believers, a denial becomes part of the plot. For skeptics, the denial is simply the obvious endpoint of a hoax. And for everyone in the middle, which is where most people actually live, the story remains entertaining because it is balanced on that narrow ridge between absurd and atmospheric. It is too strange to accept casually, yet too vivid to dismiss emotionally in a single motion. You may not believe there was an Egyptian-style underground complex in the canyon, but the image of one is difficult to evict once it moves in. a stone hallway in cool darkness, carved walls, niches, storage rooms, objects laid out in rows, a chamber hidden above a riverline, beyond easy reach, beyond chance discovery, beyond the ordinary map of things. That picture has excellent survival skills. And then there is the word forbidden. It does tremendous work, probably more than it deserves. Very often, forbidden does not actually mean hidden by a conspiracy. It means dangerous, protected, fragile, sacred, restricted, or simply closed because too many people would damage the place if allowed to wander in with snacks and poor judgment. In the Grand Canyon, cave closures are tied to resource protection and legality, not to theatrical secrecy. The National Park Service states that unauthorised caving in the park is illegal and that managing such access is a serious problem because these cave environments are unique and fragile. That is a practical explanation, not a dramatic one, though practical explanations do tend to have a hard time competing with mysterious ones after 10 p.m. But once the word forbidden gets attached to a place in popular imagination, it becomes nearly impossible to remove. Forbidden sounds intentional. It sounds like someone knows exactly what is inside and very much hopes you never learn it. It transforms a conservation policy into a thriller. It turns a closure notice into a dare. It is not fair to the actual reasons many sites are protected, but it is very good for storytelling. And if we are being honest, most legends do not spread because they are fair. They spread because they are efficient. Forbidden Caves tells you almost everything the brain needs in 2 words. There is a place. You cannot go there. Therefore something worth seeing must be inside. So tonight, as we begin, I do not want to rush straight into declaring the story solved, nor do I want to lean so hard into suspense that we forget common sense at the rim. Better to do what the reference script we're echoing does so well, and just sit with the strangeness for a moment. Not the exaggerated strangeness, but the real kind. A real canyon, real caves, real restrictions, a real 1909 newspaper story, real institutional denials, real people who still argue about it, real hunger, in almost every generation, for the idea that history is larger, weirder, and less settled than the textbooks like to admit. That hunger is not always foolish. Sometimes it pushes people to ask useful questions. Sometimes it leads to better research. Sometimes it just leads to a man on the internet pointing at a rock formation and announcing that it looks suspiciously Egyptian. Human curiosity, like the canyon itself, has its uneven edges. There is also a deeper reason stories like this stay alive, and it has less to do with Egypt than with America. The Grand Canyon is one of those landscapes that many people wrongly treat as if it became meaningful only when it entered modern national mythology. In reality, the region has deep indigenous histories and cultural connections that long predate the newspaper age, the tourist age, and certainly the conspiracy age. The canyon is not an empty stage waiting for a sensational article to give it drama. That drama was already there in the land, in the danger, in the travel routes, in the spiritual meaning, in the habitation, in the archaeology, in the difficult relationship between preservation and public access. Part of the oddity of the 1909 story is that it overlays a very old and very real human landscape with a flashy imported mystery, as if the canyon itself were not enough. In a way, that tells us something about the era that produced the legend. It wanted the familiar awe of the American Southwest, but with an extra garnish of overseas antiquity and institutional prestige. And that combination is exactly why the article landed so effectively. It was not just someone found an old cave, it was someone found a hidden world, and the hidden world appears connected to one of the most famous civilizations on Earth, and serious people are involved. That is tabloid nutrition with excellent shelf life. You can serve it in 1909, 1975, 2005 or 2026, and people will still take a bite, partly because it flatters a very human hope, that the world contains a back room no one told us about. By now, you can probably feel the shape of the path ahead. First, there is the canyon itself, which gives the legend its stage. Then, there is the article, which gives it its voice. Then come the claimed discoveries, the impossible artifacts, the institutions said to be involved, the reasons people doubted it, the reasons others clung to it, and the peculiar afterlife of a story that may have begun, a sensational print and somehow matured into modern folklore. That is where we are heading. Not in a rush, and not with a shovel in hand, but carefully, like people who know the edge is there even when the dark makes it harder to see. For now, all we need to hold on to is this. Somewhere between a real landscape and an unreliable report, one of the American West's most durable legends found its footing. It did not need everyone to believe it. It only needed enough people to wonder, and wonder is cheap to transport. It crosses decades easily. It moves from clipping to campfire, from book to radio, from television special to forum thread, and from there into the quiet part of the evening where a story about a cave in a canyon wall begins to sound just possible enough to follow a little farther. Which is why, before we get to the things the article claimed were lying in the dark, we should take one more careful step back and look at that first printed report itself, the one that opened the cave long before anyone proved there was a cave to open. This part of the story begins in a newsroom, not in a cave. Before there were maps with circles on them, before there were internet videos lowering their voices and telling you something had been hidden, before people started saying the Smithsonian had locked away the truth, there was a newspaper page printed in Phoenix in the spring of 1909. On April 5th of that year, the Arizona Gazette ran a front-page piece under the headline "Explorations in Grand Canyon," with subheads announcing an immense cavern and remarkable finds indicating that ancient people had migrated from the Orient. That article is the foundation stone for almost everything that came later. The modern legend does not come from a recovered artifact, a museum catalogue, a field report, or a confirmed excavation. It comes from a newspaper story that arrived already dressed like a discovery. That is worth slowing down for, because the tone of the article mattered almost as much as its claims. It did not read like gossip overheard in a saloon. It did not present itself as a half-remembered rumour from a ranch hand. It sounded official. It named a discoverer, G.E. Kincaid or Kincaid, depending on the retelling, and it named a professor, S.A. Jordan, said to be connected with the Smithsonian. The piece described a grand underground complex cut into stone high above the Colorado River. It claimed there were many rooms, straight walls, carved passages, inscribed tablets, copper tools, weapons, pottery, and mummified remains. It pushed the reader toward the idea that the whole thing pointed to a very old transoceanic connection, with Arizona somehow linked to Egypt and the Nile. Even by the standards of a sensational age, it was not modest material. It aimed for the kind of astonishment that makes a reader sit up and feel that history has just been rearranged between breakfast and lunch. If you picture the article in a modern setting, it almost feels too obvious. It is the kind of thing that today would be posted with a dramatic thumbnail, a red arrow, and a title promising that scholars do not want you to know the truth. But in 1909 the format was different, and that difference matters. Newspapers still carried enormous authority, especially in places where print was the main public stage on which new claims appeared. A front-page story had weight. It sat there in black ink and ordinary type, shoulder to shoulder with everything else a town was meant to take seriously. This is one reason the legend kept its footing for so long. People tend to grant extra trust to old printed lies, partly because age can make nonsense look respectable. A rumour spoken carelessly sounds like a rumour. A rumour folded into a newspaper and dated April 5th, 1909 gets to wear a tie. The basic plot the article offered was wonderfully efficient. A lone explorer on the river sees something unusual high on the canyon wall. He investigates. He finds an entrance. Beyond it lies not a small cavity, or a few scattered relics, but an immense built space with chambers and storage areas, and signs of a civilization old enough to unsettle the accepted story of the continent. Then the article adds the ingredient that gives legends a second life: institutional association. This was not just a drifter making claims in the desert. According to the piece, the Smithsonian was involved. That one move did two jobs at once. It made the find sound more serious, and it also planted the seed of the future cover-up narrative. Once an institution enters the story, people can later claim the institution suppressed the story. The article handed both of those possibilities to later readers in one neat package. There is another detail that makes the old article strangely memorable, and it is how quickly it went from plausible adventure writing into something much bigger. It did not merely suggest that ancient remains had been found in a cave. The article leaned towards civilizational implications. It framed the discovery as a key to prehistoric America, and treated the supposed material as if it could redraw the map of human migration. Discover later noted that the anonymous author presented the find as not only the oldest archaeological discovery in the United States, but one of the most valuable in the world. That is the voice of a story trying to become famous the moment it is born. It is not the cautious language of excavation reports. It is salesmanship in boots. Now, to be fair to the article, 1909 was not an era famous for holding sensational local stories at arm's length. This was the age of yellow journalism, a time when many papers treated exaggeration less as a professional failure and more as a circulation strategy. The Grand Canyon Historical Society's 2009 analysis makes this point very clearly. Dan Largo notes that journalism in that period was not yet the fully professionalized field later readers often imagine, and he places the Egyptian cave story in a newspaper environment that was already full of exaggerated mining claims, speculative reports, and articles designed to attract attention and money. He even notes that only a week before the cave piece appeared, the Gazette's rival, the Arizona Republican, had published an editorial about mines and faking. In other words, the article did not emerge from a calm world of strict verification. It came from a lively print culture where a dramatic story could travel faster than a sober one, and where readers had reason to be both interested and suspicious at the same time. That context helps explain one of the most important things about the story. Not everyone in 1909 was fooled by it. This is crucial because people sometimes imagine the legend as a discovery that was broadly accepted and then later buried. The record does not support that. Largo examined more than a dozen newspapers from the period and found that the Gazette story was mostly ignored. Only one paper, the Jerome Mining News, seems to have reprinted it without comment. The Flagstaff Coconino Sun did comment, and its comment was devastatingly brief. On April 16th, it ran a front-page notice with the headline, "Looks like a Mulhattan story." For readers of that era, this was not a mysterious phrase. It was a way of saying the thing smelled like a hoax. The reference was to Joe Mulhattan, a well-known fabricator of false but plausible newspaper stories, especially tales of spectacular discoveries. Later writers have treated that headline as an important sign that contemporaries did not regard the Gazette article as solid reporting. I like that moment, because it quietly changes the mood. It means the tale was not universally marching forward under a banner of certainty. It was already wobbling. Somewhere not long after the front-page excitement, another paper basically looked over its spectacles and said, in effect, "This again?" There is something almost comforting about that. It reminds us that skepticism is not a modern invention. People in 1909 were fully capable of recognizing a tall story when they saw one. They lived closer to the habits of those newspapers than we do, and they had fewer illusions about how easily print could be bent towards spectacle. We, from a distance, sometimes treat old print like sacred parchment, when some of the people who read it fresh were perfectly willing to roll their eyes. Still, the article survived, and one reason is that it knew exactly which buttons to press. It gave a specific location without giving one precise enough to verify easily. It named people without providing a trail robust enough to confirm them later. It placed the supposed cave in the Grand Canyon, which already had a reputation for scale, difficulty, and inaccessible walls. It loaded the interior with objects that sounded exotic and dramatic. It brought in the Smithsonian. It suggested a connection to Egypt. And it did all of this before most readers could casually cross-check archives, personnel records, archaeological notices and park files in an afternoon. A story like that does not need to be airtight to work. It only needs to be vivid. The human mind is very generous with vivid stories, especially when they take place in large landscapes and involve rooms in the dark. Later research poked holes in the article almost immediately. Discover summarised the biggest problem very simply. There is no record for either Kincaid or Jordan in the way the article would lead you to expect, and the Smithsonian has repeatedly said it has no files on such an expedition. A 2000 response quoted by Discover stated that the Smithsonian's Department of Anthropology searched its files without finding any mention of Professor Jordan, Kincaid, or a lost Egyptian civilization in Arizona. Once the newspaper had done its first important job, which was making the cave sound real enough to imagine, it had to do a second one just as carefully. It had to place that cave somewhere the reader could not immediately dismiss. Not in a flat field, not beside a road, not in a location that could be checked before supper. It had to be somewhere difficult, dramatic, and just inconvenient enough to keep disbelief from closing the file too early. So the old article set the alleged discovery high in the walls of the Grand Canyon. Later summaries of the piece note that it placed the cave 42 miles upstream from El Tovar Crystal Canyon and about 2,000 feet above the Colorado River, which is exactly the sort of detail that sounds both precise and hard to verify. It gave the reader distance, height, and isolation, and in one move turned the cave from a simple claim into a place that could hide. That mattered, because the Grand Canyon is one of the few landscapes in America where hard to reach can still sound almost too mild. The park stretches for hundreds of miles, is roughly a mile deep in many places, and contains a maze of side canyons, cliffs, benches, slopes, and rock layers that do not make access easy just because someone feels curious. The National Park Service notes that the canyon contains an extensive network of rugged gorges and slot canyons below the rims, and that some of these side canyons remain mostly hidden in plain view, requiring technical canyoneering skills to enter. That phrase, hidden in plain view, is especially useful here, because it captures the strange logic of the canyon. A place can be visible from a trail or a rim and still be practically unreachable. You can look directly at a feature and remain nowhere close to it in any practical sense. That is a gift to legend making. It allows a story to say, with a straight face, that the entrance was there all along, just out of ordinary reach. The geography also helps, because Grand Canyon caves are not an invention of folklore. They are a real and scientifically important part of the park. The National Park Service says Grand Canyon may contain as many as 2,500 caves, with several hundred already documented. It adds that the Redwall limestone hosts most of the park's caves, and that the majority are nearly inaccessible, because their openings occur on vertical cliffs. That is one of those quiet official statements that does a lot of work without trying to sound dramatic. If most cave openings are on vertical cliffs, then the idea of a high, awkward, barely reachable opening is not fantasy at all. It is normal canyon business. Of course, that does not rescue the 1909 claim. A real geological setting can still be used to support an invented discovery, but it explains why the story landed so well. It borrowed its stage from a landscape that genuinely produces cave mouths in absurd places. And absurd places in the canyon are not rare. Even the maintained trails can be serious business. The park's own descriptions are calm but not casual. It says all trails into the canyon are steep and difficult. On Grandview Trail, for example, the MPS warns that the route is rugged, narrow, steep, and often has a drop-off on one side. It explains that builders once chained or pinned log cribs to the cliff face where nature provided no foundation for a path, and adds that a fall in some sections could have catastrophic consequences. This matters because the legend does not need the exact route in the article to be real. It only needs the canyon itself to support the general idea that a person might have to edge across exposed rock, scramble through broken ledges, or follow a miner's line cut into a cliff in order to reach a hole in the wall. The canyon does support that idea, very much so. So when the article invited readers to picture a hidden opening on the canyon side, it was leaning on terrain that could do half the storytelling for it. A reader in 1909 may never have seen the inner canyon in person, but the Grand Canyon already carried a national reputation for danger, remoteness, and size. Add a cave mouth somewhere above the river, and the whole thing becomes strangely easy to visualize. A small boat on the Colorado, a sharp eye catching some irregularity in a wall of stone, a hard climb upward, a ledge where footing becomes uncertain, a dark opening above. It is a very clean piece of scene construction. Even today, with more maps and more photography and more reason to be skeptical, people still find the basic image convincing because the landscape remains convincing. The walls are full of shelves, recesses, overhangs, broken faces, and places that look as though they might lead somewhere more interesting if you were willing to risk making your insurance paperwork much more complicated. There is also something worth noticing in how the canyon handles scale. A cave 2,000 feet above the river sounds impossible until you remember what sort of country this is. Roaring Springs, for example, lies more than 3,000 feet below the North Rim, and the park warns that even well-known day hikes can become dangerous very quickly. The distance from rim to river is not merely vertical measurement on paper. It is heat, exposure, loose footing, and time. Once you get below the postcard version of the Grand Canyon, the place stops behaving like a viewpoint and starts behaving like a system of obstacles. That's why the 1909 article's numbers had real persuasive force. They were large enough to sound impressive, but not so large that the setting itself would reject them. In a gentler landscape 2,000 feet above the river would sound theatrical. In the Grand Canyon it sounds like a location somebody would regret trying to reach by noon. This is where the word hidden starts doing careful work. Hidden does not always mean invisible. In the canyon it often means screened by angle, protected by depth, or cut off by a root problem rather than by complete concealment. The National Park Service's canyoneering material makes this plain when it describes side canyons as mostly hidden in plain view and accessible only with technical skill. A place can sit quite close to a trail in horizontal distance and still remain functionally closed to anyone without ropes, route knowledge, or the willingness to spend a full day learning that gravity still has excellent attendance. The old newspaper story understood this intuitively. It placed the alleged cave in a zone where the eye could believe in it, but the body would struggle to confirm it. That is a powerful combination. It prevents easy testing, and stories love anything that prevents easy testing. Modern debunking has pointed out that this same geography also creates one of the legend's biggest weaknesses. Discover, citing Grand Canyon. Historical Society President Haley Johnson notes that the canyon's remoteness and cliff structure would have made access incredibly difficult without technical equipment, ladders, or some substantial transport plan. Johnson adds that many caves would be hard to reach even by helicopter because of the impassable cliffs. That objection is important because it shifts the issue from discovery to logistics. Finding one hidden opening is a dramatic beginning. Moving supposed statues, mummies, copper implements, and carved relics out of that opening is another matter altogether. The more elaborate the article made the interior sound, the heavier the burden of access became. A difficult ledge makes a story exciting at the entrance, but it creates headaches the moment anyone tries to imagine hauling crates back down it. Still, before the logistics collapse the fantasy, the setting does its work beautifully. That is why so many later retellings linger over the approach. They understand, even if only instinctively, that the path to the cave is half the spell. There is a big difference between an old chamber was found and an old chamber was found in a cliff face above the river where almost no one could safely go. The second version recruits the canyon as a character. It makes the landscape seem protective, selective, almost complicit. The difficult ledge becomes a filter. Only the lucky or the stubborn get through. Everyone else is left looking up. And that is a useful psychological trick, because once a place becomes hard to reach, people become strangely tolerant of weak evidence. They think, perhaps there are no photographs because the route was too dangerous. Perhaps there are no records because the site was too remote. Perhaps no one has found it again because the entrance blended back into the wall. Difficulty starts excusing absence. The canyon, by sheer physical seriousness, lends that excuse a little dignity. There is also a more ordinary explanation for why closed or inaccessible cave openings in the Grand Canyon can feel loaded with meaning. The park does in fact keep caves closed to visitation except for research. It does so because these environments are fragile, important to hydrology, rich in paleontological and archaeological material, and vulnerable to vandalism. The park even points to irreversible damage from recent scratching in cave walls. In other words, real closures exist for real reasons. But once a legend is already circulating, a practical closure becomes fuel. People hear that caves are closed and attach the closure to the old newspaper tale, even when the actual reason is conservation. That is one of the legend's quieter advantages. It can point to a genuine policy and treat it as evidence for an invented past. The canyon has closed caves because it contains fragile science and history, yet the myth hears closed and translates it into kept from the public. And then there is the visual side of it, which may be the strongest part of all. The canyon is built from layers that create benches, alcoves, vertical faces, recesses, dark seams, and pockets of shadow that can look almost architectural at the right hour. A person drifting on the river or hiking below the rim sees 1,000 hints of shelter and 100 suggestions of entrances. Most are just geology doing what geology does, but that does not stop the mind from assigning intention. The 1909 article needed that tendency. It needed readers to believe that a wall of rock could hide a mouth to something much larger. The place itself makes that believable, because the canyon is full of partial concealment. One layer juts outward, another retreats. A shelf interrupts a face. A seam darkens in late afternoon light. For a few seconds, a recess looks like a doorway, and by the time you decide it is not, another one has already appeared farther down the wall. The canyon is very good at producing false positives for curiosity. The old article, whether by instinct or craft, placed its claim exactly where this kind of visual uncertainty could help it most. Not in a chamber already known from a trail, not in some nice accessible hollow where a dozen tourists could confirm or deny the thing by the weekend. It chose a wall, a height, and a remoteness that gave the story room to breathe, and that is why the cave portion of the legend has lasted even among people who do not fully buy the Egypt part. Many listeners quietly separate the story into two halves. The first half says there was a hidden opening in a dangerous part of the canyon. That sounds possible. The second half says the opening led to an underground complex full of impossible artifacts from a lost transoceanic culture. That sounds much less sturdy. But once the first half gets accepted in the imagination, the second half is allowed to sit down and make itself comfortable. A believable entrance is enough to smuggle in unbelievable contents. So this section of the legend is really about placement. It is about a story choosing exactly the right terrain to make itself durable. The Grand Canyon supplies real caves, real cliffs, real narrow routes, real drop-offs, real hidden tributaries, and real closures. The 1909 article supplied the alleged entrance. Put those together and you get a location that feels just plausible enough to survive criticism, especially in the quiet hours when a rock wall can still seem like it is keeping a private room to itself. But once that room is imagined, the next thing the story has to do is furnish it, because a hidden opening by itself is not enough. The old report knew that too, and very soon it began describing what waited past the darkness just inside. By the time the old newspaper story moved from the canyon wall to the cave interior, it stopped sounding like an uncertain discovery and started sounding like a guided tour. That was part of its power. It did not simply claim that someone had found a hidden opening in the Grand Canyon. It claimed that once inside, the discoverers were looking at a whole-built world. And that is an important difference. A cave by itself can be dismissed as geology. A cave filled with rooms, arranged spaces, carved walls, and carefully described objects begins to feel like architecture, and architecture carries intention. The April 5th, 1909 Arizona Gazette article presented exactly that kind of place, even though later checks by the Smithsonian, local librarians, historians and journalists found no evidence that the supposed expedition or its finds were real. The article survives as the starting point of the legend, but not as verified archaeology. According to the summary preserved and analysed by the Grand Canyon Historical Society, the alleged cave was not a single chamber, but an elaborate system of tunnels and chambers, with hundreds of rooms and straight walls that were said to be obviously cut by human hands. That wording is doing a lot of work. It turns the cave from a hollow in the rock into a complex. It suggests planning, labour and a community rather than a handful of stray objects left by chance. The article wanted readers to picture not one dark pocket in the cliff, but a hidden interior large enough to belong to a people. Once a story says hundreds of rooms, the mind stops imagining a shelter and starts imagining a settlement. And that shift matters, because a settlement can hold everything that comes next. Storage areas, shrines, crypts, tools, records, and whatever else the writer wants to place in the dark. Then came the inventory, and this is where the article became almost professionally tempting. The chambers, it said, were full of artifacts, hieroglyphs, and mummies, evidently Egyptian in origin. It also described a statue that supposedly resembled Buddha. That combination is one of the strangest parts of the whole tale. It is not merely sensational, it is overstocked. Egyptian writing, Egyptian dead, and a figure with Buddhist overtones all in one hidden Grand Canyon complex. Even the Pima County Public Library's summary of the rumour notes that the article described an Egypto-Tibetan culture, which tells you how ambitious the story was trying to be. It was not content to hint at one surprising connection. It wanted several at once. It wanted the American Southwest, Egypt and Asia, all squeezed into a single underground claim, as if the author were nervous that one lost civilization might not be enough to hold the front page. The object list kept growing. The Historical Society analysis says the article described inscribed tablets, gold urns and cups, pottery, weapons, and sophisticated copper tools and instruments. It added granaries made out of cement and even a 700-foot-long dining hall where cooking utensils supposedly still remained. Then, as if the story had not yet climbed high enough, it estimated that the chambers had once housed around 50,000 people. That is not a detail slipped in carelessly. It is a number chosen to force the reader out of the category of cave and into the category of hidden city. It is one thing to claim a burial chamber or a ritual room. It is another to imply that a place in the canyon wall once served a population large enough to feel almost urban. At that point, the article was no longer merely reporting a site. It was offering a full civilization, with storage, tools, food preparation, writing, religion, and death all accounted for. One reason the story took root is that these details were oddly specific. False stories often understand this instinctively. Vagueness sounds suspicious, but exactness sounds recorded. A person may distrust many objects were found, yet pause at gold urns and cups, copper tools, granaries made out of cement, and a 700-foot-long dining hall. The details do not make the story true, of course, but they make it easier to imagine, and imagination is half the battle in a tale like this. Once the listener can see the shelves, the tools, the benches, the storage spaces, and the passageways, the legend has already won something important. It has moved out of the realm of abstract possibility and into the much more durable realm of mental picture. A story with images sticks around longer than a story with conclusions. The article also knew that buried things become more convincing when they are arranged. Random treasure sounds childish. Ordered material sounds archaeological. That is why the old report emphasised chambers, rooms, granaries, and what amounted to specialised spaces. It implied that different things were kept in different places, as if the cave system had its own logic. There were rooms for storage, rooms for the dead, and halls large enough for gathering. The objects were not presented as scattered loot, but as remains still resting roughly where a vanished people had left them. That is a very clever storytelling move, because it shifts the mood from treasure hunting to excavation. Treasure belongs to adventure. Arrangement belongs to civilization. The article wanted the second feeling much more than the first. And then there was the matter of scientific seriousness, or at least the performance of it. The Grand Canyon Historical Society's analysis notes that the article said Professor S.A. Jordan of the Smithsonian had arrived to begin a scientific examination of the cavern and was stringing electric lights through the passageways. That is a superb touch if your goal is to make readers lean in. Electric lights do not sound mystical. They sound practical. They imply that the work has moved past rumour and into method. The article also claimed that if the theories about the engraved tablets and hieroglyphics were confirmed, then the mystery of the prehistoric peoples of North America would be solved, and Egypt and the Nile and Arizona and the Colorado would be linked. Smithsonian Magazine's 2024 myth-busting piece quotes this language and states plainly that the Smithsonian has no record of any such expedition, and that the report came from only one newspaper. But as a piece of narrative design, the original article handled this beautifully. First it gave readers wonders, and then it gave them experts with lights and translations, which is one of the oldest ways to make wonders sound official. Something else is worth noticing here. The article's interior is not just full of valuables, it is full of categories: writing, religion, tools, food storage, architecture, burial, and population scale are all represented. That makes the cave feel less like a vault and more like a compressed whole society. It is as if the story wanted to pre-answer every sceptical question in advance. How do we know these were not just wanderers? Because there were many rooms. How do we know they were organised? Because there were granaries and halls. How do we know they had beliefs? Because there was an idol-like statue. How do we know they had technology? Because there were sophisticated tools. How do we know they were ancient and connected to the old world? Because there were hieroglyphics and mummies. The article built its own courtroom and then tried to supply all the exhibits at once. That is one reason it still feels weirdly complete, even now that it is treated as a hoax. At the same time, the very completeness of the thing creates its own problem. Real archaeology is often stubborn, partial and inconvenient. A site gives you fragments, not a script. It gives you debris, context, layers, and years of argument. The 1909 story gave readers something closer to a theatrical reveal, a hidden complex in the cliff, human-cut rooms, writing on tablets, mummies, storage rooms, a statue, tools, utensils, a dining hall, a population estimate, a Smithsonian professor, electric lighting, translation on the way. It is almost too generous. That does not mean people in 1909 could not have found something astonishing. History does contain discoveries that sound unlikely at first. But the article reads less like the beginning of investigation, and more like the end of one, as if the cave had already yielded not only its contents but its explanation. Modern researchers looking back on the piece have found no evidence that the expedition happened as described, and that gap between extravagant detail and missing proof is one of the main reasons the story survives as folklore rather than accepted history. There is also a quieter contrast that helps put this in perspective. The Grand Canyon does contain real archaeology. and a great deal of it is genuinely ancient. Discover reported in 2024 that archaeologists have found evidence in and around the canyon going back at least 12,000 years, including material from Clovis, archaic, basket maker, ancestral Puebloan, and more recent indigenous cultures. So the canyon is not empty of human history. Far from it. That is part of what makes the 1909 article so effective and so misleading. It attached itself to a place where real deep history exists, then inflated that history into a spectacular underground civilization with old world writing and museum-ready relics. The legend works best when it stands close to genuine archaeological seriousness, borrowing enough of its shadow to make the invention look respectable. What the story did not provide, of course, was the one thing that matters most after the newspaper ink dries. It did not leave a chain of custody, a catalogue, a verified excavation record, or confirmed artifacts in the Smithsonian's files. The Smithsonian says it has no record of the expedition, and the Pima County Public Library states directly that the story is not true, even though it continues to be repeated. That means the reported discoveries belong to a peculiar category. They are famous things that were supposedly found, but only inside the report that said they were found. They exist vividly in description, and very weakly anywhere else. The tunnels are memorable. The chambers are memorable. The artifacts are memorable. The problem is that memory is doing almost all the labour. And maybe that is why the list of alleged finds still has such a grip. It is not just mysterious, it is balanced right at the edge of visual pleasure. You can see the scene too easily. The cool passageways, the straight-cut walls, the stacked chambers, the copper tools laid out on a bench, the cups at the heads of the dead, the inscribed tablets waiting for translation, the giant hall with utensils left behind as if the last meal were interrupted. It is all arranged with the confidence of a story that wants to be retold around campfires, on radio shows, in documentaries, in old paperback books, and in the last half hour before sleep when the mind is most generous to shadows. But if we stay careful, and we should, the useful phrase here is not what was found. It is what was said to have been found. That small change in wording is the difference between archaeology and atmosphere, and the article lived almost entirely on atmosphere, because the next step in its spell was to make those objects feel even stranger by looking at them one by one, starting with the relics themselves and why they sounded so impossible in the first place. What made the old cave story so hard to forget was not only where the cave was supposed to be, but what the article said was lying inside it. A hidden opening in the Grand Canyon is one kind of mystery. A hidden opening filled with statues, weapons, tools, and relics is another kind entirely, because the second version gives the mind something to sort through. It offers not just darkness, but inventory. The 1909 Arizona Gazette story, as later summarized by the Grand Canyon Historical Society and discussed by the Smithsonian and the Pima County Public Library, claimed the cave contained chambers packed with artifacts, hieroglyphs, mummies, a statue that looked like Buddha, inscribed tablets, gold urns and cups, pottery, weapons, sophisticated copper tools and instruments, cement granaries, and even a great hall still holding cooking utensils. Modern institutions say the story is not true, but the list itself is still the thing that keeps people staring into it. A legend becomes durable when it gives you objects that seem to belong to a real place, instead of a generic fantasy. That old article understood this perfectly. It did not say treasure in the childish sense. It didn't hand readers a pile of anonymous jewels and expect them to do the rest. It gave categories that felt cultural, writing, burial, religion, tools, storage, domestic life, warfare, ritual, administration, eating. It built a whole society out of props. That is why the story lingers so stubbornly. Once readers were told there were inscribed tablets, utensils, shelves for the dead, and structured rooms, the cave stopped being just a cavity in rock and started behaving in the imagination like a hidden civilization with routines, beliefs, and habits. A few relics might suggest looters. A full range of objects suggests a people. The article knew that, whether by instinct or by craft, and it organised its fantasy accordingly. Take the statue first because it is the oddest object in the whole reported collection. The article, in the form preserved by later historians, said there was a statue that looked like Buddha. Not Egyptian-looking alone, not simply ancient, but Buddha-like. That one detail may be stranger than the mummies. A mummy fits the basic old-world spectacle the story was aiming for. A Buddha-like statue pushes the cave into a broader, more theatrical category. It says the alleged site was not merely Egyptian, but somehow linked to a hazier Oriental antiquity, which is exactly the word the Gazette used in its headline and body text when it suggested ancient people migrated from the East. The Pima County Public Library later summarised the rumour as one about an Egypto-Tibetan culture, which tells you just how mixed and ambitious the original claim really was. It was not content with one impossible bridge between Arizona and another civilization. It wanted several, as though the author feared that one exotic tradition might not make enough noise on a front page. That Buddha-like statue is also a clue to the story's method. It was not trying to sound archaeologically disciplined. It was trying to sound impressive in a way ordinary readers would instantly grasp. Very few readers in 1909 needed a careful explanation of regional iconography or funerary typology. But tell them there was a figure resembling Buddha in a chamber in the Grand Canyon, and they immediately understand that the find is supposed to be staggeringly out of place. It is a shortcut to astonishment. The same goes for hieroglyphs. The average reader may not know one script from another, but hieroglyphs are a famous kind of oldness. They come preloaded with authority. If a cave contains them, it sounds ancient before anyone has even translated a mark. The article played on recognisable signs of antiquity, not on cautious analysis. It stocked the cave with things a non-specialist would read as proof, because legends aimed at the public are always built from symbols the public already knows how to admire. Then there are the weapons, and those deserve more attention than they usually get, because weapons make a culture feel practical. A statue can be ceremonial, tablets can be intellectual, gold cups can be decorative, but weapons suggest danger, conflict, and organised defence. Once the article said weapons were among the objects in the cave, the hidden population stopped seeming like a purely priestly or symbolic people, and started seeming like one that expected trouble. That changes the whole atmosphere of the chamber. Suddenly the shelves are not just full of sacred odds and ends, they belong to a group that armed itself. Even if the article never carefully described the weapons, the very word adds pressure. It makes the cave feel inhabited by memory rather than museum display. Someone could eat here, write here, store grain here, bury the dead here, and also fight here. That is how the cave begins to resemble a compressed world rather than a stash. The copper tools and instruments do similar work, but in a more respectable direction. Sophisticated copper tools and instruments is exactly the kind of phrase that helps a legend sound intelligent. Treasure stories often embarrass themselves by becoming too shiny. They lean too hard on gold and forget the less glamorous material that would make a site believable. Tools correct that. Tools tell the reader this was not only a place of wealth or ritual, but also a place of technique. And the word sophisticated is doing perhaps the heaviest lifting of all, because it quietly tells the audience how to feel before they have examined anything, not merely copper tools. Sophisticated copper tools. That is the newspaper writer nudging the reader with an elbow and saying, "See? This is advanced." Never mind that no catalogue, photograph or Smithsonian record ever appeared to support the claim. In the article's own universe, tools were vital because they gave the hidden people competence. Whoever lived in these rooms was not wandering helplessly in a hole in the ground. They were organised, equipped, and capable of making things. The gold urns and cups, by contrast, gave the story its luxury. They are not practical objects in the same way tools are. They are the things that make the cave gleam in the mind. The legend did not need them for logic. It needed them for atmosphere. Gold does not just imply value. It implies status, ceremony, special handling, perhaps burial, perhaps offering, perhaps rulers. A cave full of stone tools would feel austere. A cave with gold cups feels important. It begins to sound like a place where rank existed, where objects could be elevated above daily use, where hidden chambers might be shrines as much as storerooms. This is why the artifact list has such good balance from a storytelling perspective. Some objects ground the site in usefulness, others lift it into splendour. Pottery and utensils say ordinary life. Gold cups say something above ordinary life. Between them, the cave begins to contain both a kitchen and a throne room, even if the article never had the discipline to separate one from the other. The pottery and cooking utensils are especially good details because they make the impossible feel domestic. The 1909 account, as later summarised by the Grand Canyon Historical Society, claimed there was a 700-foot-long dining hall that still held cooking utensils. That is a ridiculous image in one sense, but a very sticky one. People remember it because it transforms the cave from a tomb into a place where meals once happened. It takes all the grandeur of mummies and statues and quietly introduces bowls, ladles, or whatever else the reader chooses to picture. Suddenly the underground world feels less like a shrine and more like a community. And communities are much easier to imagine living in hidden places than are purely ceremonial cults. The granaries made out of cement push that feeling even further. Granaries imply planning, storage, surplus, seasons, responsibility, and the very unglamorous question of how a population keeps itself fed. Once granaries enter the picture, the hidden cave civilization has crossed into civic life. It has logistics. It has hunger. It has tomorrow. And then there are the mummies, perhaps the most famous items in the whole story. The Historical Society analysis notes that in the Gazette version, there were tiers of mummies, each one occupying a separate hewn shelf. That is one of those details that either instantly captivates you or instantly makes you laugh, depending on your tolerance for old newspaper grandeur. But it is unforgettable. It is carefully staged. The dead are not thrown together. They are arranged, each on its own hewn shelf, as though even death followed a plan in this underground place. It is not difficult to see why this image survived. Rows of preserved bodies in the dark are cinematic even on the printed page. They also solve another narrative problem for the article. They make antiquity visible. Tools could be recent. Pottery could be misread. But mummies announce deep time at once. They are famous shorthand for old civilization, and the article needed that shorthand badly. The moment you add mummies to a cave in Arizona, the place stops being regional and starts trying to join the grand museum of world mystery. The problem, of course, is that the mummies also reveal how suspiciously assembled the whole list is. Don Lago's 2009 historical analysis argued that the Grand Canyon story resembles older cave hoaxes associated with Joe Mulhattan, who was famous for inventing marvellous stories about caves, mummies, hieroglyphs, and astonishing relics. Lago specifically notes repeated patterns between the 1909 account and earlier Mulhattan-style cave stories, including Egyptian-looking mummies, mysterious writing, and dramatic built interiors, all tailored to impress newspaper readers. The Coconino Sun's 1909 dismissal of the Gazette item as looking like a Mulhattan story shows that even some contemporaries recognised the recipe. So when we linger over the relic list, we're not just looking at what was claimed to be in the dark. We are also looking at the anatomy of a classic hoax structure. Choose famous signs of antiquity, mix sacred and practical objects, add exotic cultural crossover, then place everything in a difficult cave where verification becomes inconvenient. Still, the reason the story survives is that the recipe is good. Not true, but good. Think about how carefully the objects answer unspoken questions. Was it a real people? Yes, because there were storage spaces and cooking tools. Was it an advanced people? Yes, because there were sophisticated instruments and inscribed tablets. Was it a spiritual people? Yes, because there was a statue and ceremonial-looking vessels. Was it ancient? Yes, because there were mummies and hieroglyphs. Was it large? Yes, because the article claimed hundreds of rooms and space for 50,000 inhabitants. Each class of object shores up another part of the fantasy. That is why you can spend years debunking the site and still find the legend alive in podcasts, forum posts, and late-night documentaries. People are not only attached to the idea of a hidden cave, they're attached to the satisfying completeness of the object list inside it. It feels like an answer set. There is also something psychologically helpful, if that is the right word, about how these alleged relics divide into familiar museum categories. Even if the cave was hidden and dangerous, the objects themselves are comforting in a peculiar way because readers already know where such things belong in the mind. Statues go in a religion case, weapons go in a war case, cups and urns go in a burial or ritual case, tools go in a technology case, tablets go in a writing case, mummies go in a death case. A story becomes easier to believe when it arranges impossibility into recognizable drawers. The reader may never have seen the cave, but the reader has seen museums, books, illustrations, or at least popular images of ancient civilizations. So the article turned its hidden world into something mentally sortable. It domesticated the impossible by making it curator-friendly. Had it stocked the cave with things no one recognized, the legend might have failed. Instead, it stocked the cave with famous forms of ancientness. And yet the very familiarity of those relics is what makes the next question unavoidable. Why these relics? Why do they sound so specifically Egyptian, and at moments vaguely Buddhist, in the rock walls of Arizona? Why does the article reach for the Nile, hieroglyphs, Buddha-like statuary and Oriental migration instead of grounding itself in anything local? That is where the story stops being only a tale of hidden objects and becomes a tale of cultural impossibility. Because once the article laid its statues, weapons, and relics in the dark, it had also laid down a much larger claim about where they supposedly came from. And that is where the whole canyon tale starts sounding less like a lost chamber and more like a challenge to the entire map of history. By the time the old cave story reached the point where it started sounding Egyptian, it stopped being merely dramatic and became genuinely hard to take at face value. A hidden chamber in the Grand Canyon is one thing. Strange objects in that chamber are another. But once the article began talking about hieroglyphics, mummies, a connection to Ramses, and even a Buddha-like figure, the story moved out of the range of ordinary archaeological surprise and into something much larger. That is why people still react so strongly to this part of the legend. It is not just mysterious, it is aggressively out of place. The 1909 Arizona Gazette article claimed that a Smithsonian-backed expedition had found a great underground citadel containing relics that pointed to an Oriental origin, possibly from Egypt, and the Smithsonian now says flatly that it has no record of any such expedition, and that the tale was only reported by one newspaper. Turn 499214 view 3. That possibly from Egypt line is really the hinge of the whole story. Without it, the article would still be a wild canyon mystery, but it would not have the same long afterlife. Plenty of local legends fade because they stay local. This one did not stay local. It reached across oceans. It took a cave in Arizona and tried to tie it to one of the most famous ancient civilizations on Earth. Once that happened, the story became much harder to forget and much harder to believe. The same move that made it memorable also made it suspicious. The Gazette claimed that tablets with hieroglyphics could link Egypt and the Nile and Arizona and the Colorado. That is the kind of sentence designed to make a reader feel history is about to be rewritten in one afternoon. It is also the kind of sentence that immediately raises the question of evidence, because a claim that large cannot survive on atmosphere alone. Turn 499214 view 3. And the evidence, when later researchers went looking for it, simply was not there. Discover's review of the story calls the article unequivocally false, notes that the tale came from a phony newspaper story, and quotes the Smithsonian's Department of Anthropology saying it searched its files without finding any mention of Professor Jordan Kincaid or a lost Egyptian civilization in Arizona. The Pima County Public Library says the same thing in plainer terms. The story dates to the April 5th, 1909 front-page article. It claimed an Egypto-Tibetan culture in the canyon, and it is not true. Once you put those points side by side, one major reason the Egyptian angle sounds impossible becomes obvious. A discovery that would overturn American archaeology, rewrite part of ancient world history, and create one of the most important museum stories in the United States somehow left no accepted excavation record, no Smithsonian paper trail, no confirmed objects, and no verified site. That is not how discoveries of this scale behave. Turn 499214 view 0, https://www.discovermagazine.com/no Egyptian artifacts word never found in the grand. There is another problem, and it sits right inside the object list itself. The alleged finds were not just Egyptian. They were mixed in a way that feels more like sensational writing than like a real archaeological assemblage. The old story did not say, in a measured way, that a site contained an unfamiliar script or a few unexpected items. It pushed together hieroglyphics, mummies, a Buddha-like statue, copper instruments, urns, cups, weapons, granaries, and a giant dining hall. The Pima County Public Library's summary preserves the phrase Egypto-Tibetan culture, which is almost too revealing. It sounds less like the messy reality of a dig, and more like a writer trying to widen the appeal of a hoax by borrowing prestige from several ancient traditions at once. Egypt for grandeur, Tibet or Buddhism for mystique, Arizona for setting, the Smithsonian for authority. That is not what careful archaeology looks like. It is what a very ambitious newspaper yarn looks like when it wants to impress as many readers as possible. Turn 499214, view 4, https://www.library.pima.gov/content/grand-canyon-e. Real archaeology is usually much more awkward than that. It is local first. It is context heavy. It involves layers, material analysis, dating, comparison, and a great deal of arguing over details. It rarely arrives already translated into a global headline. A site in the Grand Canyon would be studied in relation to the long and well-established archaeological record of the region, and that record is not blank. Discover reported in 2024 that archaeologists have found evidence of human presence in and around the Grand Canyon going back at least 12,000 years, including material from Clovis, archaic, basket maker, and ancestral Puebloan contexts, as well as more recent artifacts connected to living indigenous groups including the Navajo, Hopi, and Southern Paiute. So one reason the Egyptian cave story sounded impossible is that it was not entering an empty map. It was colliding with a real, deep, regionally grounded archaeological history that already had its own chronology, material culture, and continuity. Turn 499214 view 1. That point matters a great deal. The Grand Canyon is not some historical blank spot where anything could be inserted without consequence. If unmistakable Egyptian material had truly been found there in a controlled context, it would not have been a curious side note. It would have been one of the most astonishing archaeological discoveries in the modern world. It would affect debates about long-distance contact, migration, chronology, trade, and the interpretation of ancient North America. It would produce publications, disputes, authentication work, conservation efforts, press coverage from many outlets, and years of serious study. Instead, what the story actually produced was a legend cycle, a wave of retellings and repeated denials from the very institution it claimed as sponsor. That mismatch is one of the cleanest signs that the article was trying to sell wonder rather than report a verifiable find. Turn 499214 view 3, https://www.smithsonian-mag.com/smithsonian-institution/busting-13-of-most. There is also the question of how the Egyptian idea became so sticky in the first place, because part of the answer has nothing to do with artifacts and a surprising amount to do with names on maps. The Grand Canyon contains features called Isis Temple, Horus Temple, Tower of Ra, Osiris Temple, and others that sound unmistakably Egyptian to modern ears. The National Park Service explains that many Grand Canyon place names were assigned by non-native map makers, especially Clarence Dutton, who preferred to project names from world literature and religion onto the terrain. The NPS even quotes Dutton's associate Frederick Dellenbaugh, objecting to this Oriental and Egyptian nomenclature. In other words, the Egyptian names in the canyon do not point to Egyptian settlement. They point to 19th century naming habits among Euro-American geologists and explorers. Turn 499214 View 2. That is one of those facts that instantly takes some air out of the balloon. Because once a person hears Isis Temple or Horus Temple, the mind starts doing exactly what minds do. It connects labels to legends. It assumes the names must preserve a deeper memory. It begins to wonder whether somebody knew something. But the National Park Service's explanation is much simpler and much more ordinary. Dutton liked grand, mythic, global names. The canyon was full of imposing landforms. He matched one to the other. Mojave Point's park description still casually lists nearby formations such as Horus, Osiris, Ra, Set, and Isis, which shows how normalized those names became on official maps and viewpoints. They are part of the canyon's mapped vocabulary now, but that is a result of naming tradition, not evidence of a lost Egyptian colony tucked into the rock. Turn 737244 search 3, https://w-mojave-point.htm. And that may be one reason the Gazette story chose Egypt instead of, say, merely claiming an unknown local civilization. Egypt had cultural gravity. It still does. Mention Egypt and people immediately picture stone chambers, mummies, writing, old kings, preserved dead, solemn objects in dim rooms, and histories that feel both glamorous and far away. It is probably the most efficient ancient label a sensational story can use. You do not need to educate the reader very much. The word does the work for you. Put Egypt in Arizona and the contradiction itself becomes the hook. That is another reason the alleged artifacts sounded impossible. Not because the article carefully reasoned its way to Egypt, but because it reached too quickly for a civilization already famous for the exact kinds of relics readers would recognize: mummies, hieroglyphs, urns, carved chambers, mystery. It is almost suspiciously convenient. Turn 499214 View 3, https://www.smithsonian-mag.com/smithsonian-institution/busting-13-of-the SM-tent-myths-135407460/. The story's timing makes that even easier to understand. Early 20th century newspapers were not working in the style of modern archaeological journals. Discover describes the Gazette article as an anonymous story packed with wild claims, and the Grand Canyon Historical Society's later research found that most papers of the time ignored it, while one local paper dismissed it as looking like a Mulhattan story, meaning something in the tradition of Joe Mulhattan, a well-known hoaxer of marvellous newspaper tales. That background helps explain the article's behaviour. It is not just wrong in the modern sense. It is wrong in a very old-fashioned newspaper way. It is built to grab. It is stacked with recognisable motifs. It uses the authority of print and institutions to make an improbable tale feel grounded. And because Egypt was already a shorthand for extreme antiquity and buried splendour, it became the perfect ingredient. Turn 499214 View 0, https://www.discovermagazine.com/no-, Egyptian-RTN- the Grand-Canyon-44993. There is also the practical side, which tends to sound dull, until you remember that dull questions are often the ones that break legends open. If this site had contained large, unmistakable Old World artifacts, how are they documented, packed, moved, preserved, and studied? Discover quotes. Grand Canyon Historical Society President Haley Johnson, saying the canyon's remoteness would have made access incredibly difficult without technical gear or ladders, and that it would have been impossible to haul all the supposed artifacts into such a remote and inaccessible cave without a helicopter, which of course was not a serious option in 1909. That does not merely challenge the cave's existence, it challenges the article's whole material confidence. The more dramatic the alleged Egyptian collection becomes, the more absurd the logistics become. A single odd object is one thing. A fully stocked underground citadel with bodies, metal items, inscribed material, ceremonial vessels and large built spaces is another. The article wanted a discovery with museum scale, but the canyon would have demanded museum logistics, and those never appear in any confirmed record. Turn 499214 view 0. Then there is the matter of context, which real archaeology cares about more than treasure hunters ever do. An object is not just an object. It is where it was found, what layer it was in, what sat near it, what materials surrounded it, whether the site had been disturbed, whether carbon dating or other methods can help place it, whether the design matches known traditions, whether the raw materials came from the region, and whether the pattern of finds tells a coherent story. The Gazette article did not think that way. It piled signs of antiquity into a dramatic setting and let the reader do the rest. That is why the alleged artifacts sounded impossible to anyone thinking archaeologically rather than theatrically. The story gave recognizability instead of context. It gave symbols of Egypt, not a defensible chain of evidence connecting Arizona to the Nile. Turn 499214 view 3, https://www.smithsonian-institution/busti-ent-myths-135407460/. And yet, for all of that, I can see why this is the part of the legend people remember most vividly. Because the contradiction is so clean. Egypt in Arizona, mummies in the Grand Canyon, hieroglyphs above the Colorado River. It sounds impossible in exactly the way that makes a story catchy. Too ordinary and the tale dies. Too absurd and it becomes comedy. But this one sits in that oddly durable middle ground where the claim is huge, the setting is dramatic, the objects are famous, and the official record is thin enough to let imagination keep sneaking in through the side door. Add in the real Egyptian-themed place names in the canyon, and suddenly a paper hoax gains the look of a clue trail. Not a real clue trail, but one with very good scenery. Turn 49900/what-s-in-a-name.htm. So when people say the alleged artifacts sounded impossible, that is not just modern skepticism being rude to an old mystery. It is a plain description of how the claim behaves under even moderate pressure. The story asked readers to accept an Egyptian or Egypto-Tibetan assemblage in a canyon with a well-established indigenous archaeological record, to accept a Smithsonian-backed expedition with no Smithsonian record, to accept a discovery that would have reshaped world archaeology without leaving the normal evidence trail such a discovery should generate, and to accept a list of relics that feels curated for maximum amazement, rather than reported with scientific discipline. That is a very large stack of requests for one newspaper article to make. Turn 499214 view 4, which leaves us with the next obvious turn in the path. because once the story had persuaded readers to imagine impossible artifacts in the canyon, it needed something else to keep the whole thing alive across decades. It needed an institution big enough to make the discovery feel official, and big enough to make the denial feel suspicious, and that is where the Smithsonian entered the cave and, in a way, never quite left. The moment the old Grand Canyon cave story brought in the Smithsonian, it changed from a strange newspaper adventure into something much more durable. Up to that point, a reader could treat it like a colourful regional yarn. A man on the river sees something high on a cliff, climbs to it, enters a hidden chamber, and finds odd objects inside. That is already dramatic. But once the article said the Smithsonian was financing the work, and once it introduced Professor Cesar Jordan as a representative of that institution, the whole thing put on a different coat. It no longer sounded like a lone explorer exaggerating in the desert. It sounded like official knowledge. That one choice gave the story a backbone it otherwise would never have had, because readers tend to trust institutions even when they are hearing about them second-hand through one enthusiastic newspaper. The 1909 Arizona Gazette piece did this very deliberately. Smithsonian Magazine's 2024 myth-busting article quotes the paper's claim that the archaeologists of the Smithsonian Institute, which is financing the expeditions, had made discoveries suggesting an Oriental, possibly Egyptian origin for the cave population. It also quotes the article's larger promise that if the supposed hieroglyphic tablets were translated, Egypt and the Nile and Arizona and the Colorado would be linked by a vast historical chain. That is not the language of cautious reporting. It is the language of a story trying to borrow authority and spectacle at the same time. The Gazette wanted readers to feel that the find was both sensational and endorsed by serious experts. It wanted mystery with a letterhead. And this is where the institutional mystery really begins, because once later readers went looking for the letterhead, it was not there. The Smithsonian's current position is plain. It has no record of such an expedition, and Smithsonian Magazine now lists the entire claim as one of the institution's persistent myths. The article says the report came from only one newspaper, notes that the Smithsonian has no record of any such fieldwork, and adds that it is doubtful Kincaid even existed as described. Discover reported the same basic problem in 2023, saying the tale came from a phony newspaper story and that Smithsonian staff had searched their files without finding mention of Professor Jordan Kincaid or a lost Egyptian civilization in Arizona. That is a very severe gap. A claimed discovery large enough to redraw archaeology should leave a great many footprints. Instead, the trail seems to vanish at the exact point where formal documentation should begin. There is a small detail in all of this that people often pass too quickly, but it deserves a little attention because it tells you something about the article's texture. The Gazette referred to the Smithsonian Institute, not the Smithsonian Institution. Discover notes this specifically in its summary of the later denial, and while a naming error by itself does not prove a hoax, it does not help the article look careful either. It is the sort of mistake that becomes more interesting after the rest of the story starts collapsing. If you were inventing a tale and wanted it to sound official, you might name a famous institution but not handle it with perfect precision. A real expedition can survive a typographical slip. A fabricated story often gathers such slips like lint. The named men in the article create the same kind of problem. Discover says there is no record of the existence of either Kincaid or Jordan in the way the article would lead readers to expect, and it notes that the Gazette had published an earlier piece in March 1909 about part of Kincaid's river adventure, without mentioning any Egyptian cave at all. Smithsonian Magazine echoes the uncertainty, saying it is doubtful Kincaid existed. This is an important point because legends often survive by clinging to names. A name makes a story feel anchored. It gives people something to search for. But when the search produces almost nothing beyond the original tale, the names start to feel less like evidence and more like props. The story needed a discoverer and a professor. It gave itself both. The problem came later, when the world asked to see the rest of their paperwork. And once the paperwork fails to appear, the absence itself becomes the next stage of the legend. For skeptics, the lack of records is the cleanest sign that the story is a hoax. For believers, the lack of records becomes evidence that the records were buried, destroyed, hidden, or quietly absorbed into some archive no outsider is allowed to examine. This is one reason the Smithsonian became so central to the myth's afterlife. A famous institution does not merely make the original story sound credible, it also makes the later denial feel suspicious to people who are already inclined toward cover-up thinking. A nameless editor cannot sustain a century of conspiracy very easily. The Smithsonian can. That does not make the suspicion justified, it just makes it narratively efficient. An institution is large enough to sound authoritative and large enough to sound secretive, depending on which mood the audience prefers. What is especially telling, though, is how little traction the story had in its own moment. Dan Largo's 2009 research for the Grand Canyon Historical Society makes this point sharply. He says the Gazette article should have been major news for Arizona if it were true. Egyptians in Arizona, a major Smithsonian expedition, a new Colorado River discovery, all of that should have set papers talking across the region. Instead, the story was almost totally ignored by other Arizona newspapers. Of more than a dozen papers checked, only one, the Jerome Mining News, reprinted it without comment. One other paper, Flagstaff's Coconino Sun, did comment, but not in the spirit the Gazette would have wanted. On April 16th, it ran the headline, "Looks like a Manhattan Story." That is one of the coldest possible receptions a miraculous discovery can receive. That old Coconino Sun reaction matters more than it might appear to. Modern people often imagine that debunking happened much later, after historians and librarians dug through archives. But some of the skepticism was immediate. Largo explains that by 1909 the name Joe Manhattan already carried a reputation for plausible-sounding newspaper hoaxes, especially stories about marvellous discoveries. His article quotes earlier descriptions of Manhattan as a man whose business was inventing marvellous stories or lies, including tales of caves with ridiculous or spectacular contents. In other words, the Gazette story did not merely become hoax-like in hindsight. It already resembled a known type. That helps explain why the institutional trail went cold so quickly. It may never have been warm in the first place. Still, there is a reason the public did not treat that local skepticism as the final word. The Smithsonian is larger than the Coconino Sun. The more famous name won, the longer memory. Most people encountering the legend later do not begin with the little Arizona newspaper that sniffed the story and shrugged. They begin with the spectacular claim itself, a Smithsonian expedition, Egyptian ruins, missing records. By the time they learn that a local paper dismissed it as a Manhattan-style yarn, the story has already done its work. They are emotionally inside the cave. And once a person is emotionally inside the cave, the institutional denial begins to sound less like clarification and more like part of the scenery. The modern afterlife of the story makes this even clearer. Discover notes that the Smithsonian has been inundated with inquiries about the supposed expedition over the years, despite the fact that the investigation never took place. Largo's essay tracks how the myth grew new layers in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, especially through the work of writers and paranormal broadcasters who treated the old newspaper clipping as the seed of a much larger hidden history narrative. By then, the institutional silence had become part of the entertainment. If the Smithsonian denied it, that could be read not as the end of the story, but as the point where the real story began. This is how folklore mutates when it passes through conspiracy culture. A missing file is no longer a problem. It is a promise. Largo shows exactly how elaborate those later claims became. He writes that as theories grew more elaborate, so did accusations of a cover-up by the Smithsonian and the National Park Service. He describes later claims that the Smithsonian had destroyed evidence of Egyptians in America, even towing a barge full of artifacts into the Atlantic and dumping them overboard. He also notes claims that the Park Service had closed airspace, hiking entry, and cave access to hide the truth. These are not minor embellishments. They are the kind of expansion that happens when a story no longer has to answer to evidence and can simply grow toward whatever sounds most dramatic. The original institutional absence did not stay empty, it got furnished by imagination. What makes that process so effective is that it piggybacks on real things. The National Park Service really does restrict access to caves in the Grand Canyon. The canyon really does contain fragile archaeological and geological resources. The Smithsonian really is a large institution with archives most people will never personally inspect. Those realities create a good environment for suspicion, especially when combined with a century-old newspaper article that named the institution directly. Real closure plus false story equals fertile rumour. The fact that a cave is closed for conservation can be reinterpreted as evidence that a cave is closed for concealment. The fact that a museum archive does not have a file can be reinterpreted as proof that a file was removed. This is how practical bureaucracy gets drafted into myth against its will. And then there is the emotional pattern underneath all of this, which is older than this story, and will probably outlive it too. Many people are willing to believe that institutions sometimes minimize, misfile, mishandle, or even suppress information. That suspicion does not come from nowhere. Large institutions do make mistakes. They do lose material. They do tell incomplete stories. But legends thrive by taking that general truth and attaching it to a specific falsehood with just enough confidence to keep it upright. The Grand Canyon cave story uses the public's existing skepticism as fuel. It says, in effect, you already know powerful institutions are not perfect, so perhaps this is one of the things they hid. The logic is emotionally persuasive even when it's evidentially weak. That is why direct denials often fail to kill such myths. The myth has already absorbed the denial into its own structure. There is also a quieter reason the trail went cold that has nothing to do with conspiracy and everything to do with newspaper culture. Discover points out that the Arizona Gazette article was anonymous, and Largo places it in the world of yellow journalism, speculative mining stories, and a press environment where sensational copy could flourish without the professional safeguards readers might assume today. If the piece was designed to sell amazement rather than report a real expedition, then there may never have been a deeper institutional trail to follow. The coldness of the trail is not always the sign of something removed. Sometimes it is the sign of something never built. That is less dramatic, certainly, but it fits the evidence much better. A phantom expedition leaves phantom paperwork. Another revealing contrast comes from asking what a real Smithsonian-linked discovery in the Grand Canyon would have looked like. It would likely generate field notes, correspondence, catalogue numbers, transport arrangements, internal memoranda, publicity or secrecy decisions that still leave traces, and some kind of accepted chain of custody for the material collected. It would also attract more than one newspaper if the discovery were truly as staggering as the Gazette claimed. Yet Smithsonian Magazine says the report was only made by one newspaper and continues to run amok anyway. That phrase is wonderfully restrained, but it captures the oddness of the whole affair. The story behaves socially like a massive event and archivally like a ghost. It is loud in memory and quiet in records. The institutional mystery, then, is not really that the Smithsonian denied a true discovery. The mystery is how effectively the Smithsonian's name was used to manufacture durability for a likely hoax. The institution was written into the tale at the exact point where the tale needed weight. Later, when the institution said no such expedition appears in its records, the denial was treated by many people not as correction but as suspicious behaviour. The name continued to do work in both directions. It made the article sound important in 1909, and it made the myth sound persecuted in later decades. That is very efficient storytelling, even if it is terrible history. A famous museum became both the badge and the villain. There is one more thing I find strangely important here. The trail did not just go cold in the Smithsonian, it also went cold in the landscape. No confirmed rediscovery of the supposed Great Underground Citadel. No accepted archaeological team refining the entrance and documenting the chambers. No verified objects surfacing with a secure provenance. No little trickle of independent evidence gathering under the big original claim. The institutional denial matters, yes, but it matters even more because the physical world never stepped in to rescue the story. The canyon, for all its ledges and shadows and hidden alcoves, never delivered the second witness that legends like this desperately need. So the myth survived by moving farther away from the ground and deeper into a world of accusations, missing files, and forbidden zones. And that drift toward forbidden zones is probably the next place we need to go, because once the institutional record thinned out, the story leaned harder on the landscape itself. If the Smithsonian would not confirm the cave, perhaps the canyon was keeping it. If the archives produced nothing, perhaps the cliff still held something. If the records went cold, perhaps the real barrier was not paper at all, but access, closure, restricted ground, and the unsettling feeling that in a place as large as the Grand Canyon, a dark opening in the wrong wall could remain out of reach long enough for a legend to keep breathing. By the time a story like this reaches the phrase forbidden zone, something interesting has already happened in the mind. The place has stopped being a landscape and started behaving like a locked room. That is part of why the Grand Canyon cave legend lasts. The canyon already contains so many real restrictions, closures, protected areas, and difficult routes that it does not take much imagination to turn closed for safety or preservation into closed because something is being hidden. But those are not the same thing, and it is useful to stay calm about the difference. The Grand Canyon feels closed, protected, and untouchable in many places because it actually is all three, just not usually for the reasons a conspiracy story prefers. The official record shows a patchwork of rules built around resource protection, visitor safety, tribal jurisdiction, aviation controls, and the basic fact that a lot of this terrain is fragile or dangerous in ways that do not care whether a person is curious. Start with the caves themselves, because this is the heart of the mood. The National Park Service says Grand Canyon may contain as many as 2,500 caves, with several hundred documented. Under current park policy, all caves in Grand Canyon National Park are closed to public visitation and may only be entered by scientists with research permits. The same NPS materials explain why. These caves contain delicate cave features, rare minerals, important archaeological sites, significant Pleistocene fossils, and habitat for wildlife, including bats and the endangered California condor. The park's cave management page adds that unauthorized caving is illegal and describes irreversible vandalism in at least one cave, which gives you a very ordinary and very strong explanation for why officials do not want casual visitors wandering underground with bright ideas and poor restraint. This is not theatrical secrecy. It is what happens when fragile places meet large numbers of people. But once you know the caves are real and closed, you can see how quickly the legend starts rubbing its hands together. The cliffs make that feeling even stronger. The NPS Geodiversity Atlas says the majority of Grand Canyon caves occur in the Redwall limestone, and that most of those cave openings are nearly inaccessible because they lie on vertical cliffs. That is one of the most important official statements in the whole canyon mystery conversation, because it does not merely say there are caves. It says the caves are often in exactly the sort of places the old newspaper story needed. High, awkward, dangerous, and well beyond the comfort level of ordinary visitors. So when people hear Forbidden Zone, they often imagine some mapped-off secret sector, when in reality a good portion of the canyon is functionally off-limits simply because gravity still works, and the openings are in places that would turn a casual excursion into an accident report. A hole in a cliff face does not need a conspiracy to remain untouched. Sometimes it only needs a vertical wall, no formal route, and a park service that does not want to spend the weekend retrieving someone who believed a flashlight and confidence were a complete safety plan. Then there is the backcountry, which is another major source of the canyon's off-limits feeling. The National Park Service says backcountry permits are required for overnight camping outside developed campgrounds, for overnight use at Tuweep Campground, for off-river camping by river trip participants, for pack rafting outside a river permit, and for winter overnight use on the North Rim. The park's permits page also says that private non-commercial river trips require river permits, with long trips from Lee's Ferry distributed through a weighted lottery. This is not a tiny amount of regulation. It means large parts of the canyon can be visited only under very specific conditions, with planning, paperwork, dates, and approved itineraries. For a person who only sees the canyon from the rim, that structure can make the place feel less like a public park and more like a patchwork of access layers. Some areas are open for day hiking. Some require overnight permits, some require river permits, some are seasonal, some are shut because conditions change, some are accessible only if you already belong to a different trip. None of that is mysterious in itself, but together it teaches the visitor that the canyon is not a free-roaming landscape. It is managed, and managed landscapes always attract stories about what management must be hiding. That feeling becomes even stronger once archaeology enters the picture, because Grand Canyon is not just large, it is culturally dense. The park's archaeological site etiquette policy states that 12,000 years of human history in Grand Canyon have produced an astounding number and diversity of well-preserved archaeological sites. The same policy warns that these places are very fragile, that many have never been stabilized, and that visitors should avoid stepping on walls, artifacts, and easily eroded slopes. It also states that camping in non-designated camps that contain archaeological sites is strictly prohibited. And it adds something that should probably be said more often in stories like this. 11 modern-day American Indian tribes maintain connections to Grand Canyon archaeological sites as a direct link to their history and ancestors. That means these spaces are not just old things in a scenic setting. They are heritage, evidence, place memory, and in many cases still culturally alive. A person can call that a forbidden zone if they want, but the phrase flattens a more serious reality. What feels untouchable is often untouchable because it should be. The park's own preservation work makes the same point from another angle. Grand Canyon's Vanishing Treasures program says the park contains diverse prehistoric and historic architectural remains, including pueblos, cliff dwellings, granaries, agricultural and water control features, ancient trail systems, as well as later Native American and Euro-American structures. The program explains that many of these remains are exposed to erosion, gravity, burrowing animals, visitation damage and vandalism, and that preservation crews document and stabilize them to slow deterioration. One NPS image caption from that page shows archaeologists roped into a cliff face while assessing a stone granary. That single detail is almost comically useful for understanding why the canyon feels untouchable. Many real sites are not simply fragile. They're perched in difficult places, sometimes requiring technical access even for trained professionals. So when a legend says there are hidden structures in dangerous walls, it is borrowing energy from a true thing. There really are architectural remains in difficult canyon locations. The difference is that real archaeologists document, conserve and contextualize them, instead of announcing Egyptian dynasties in the dark. There is also the matter of tribal land and jurisdiction, which adds another layer to the public sense that not everything in the canyon is open to everyone. The National Park Service explains that Sapai Village in Havasu Canyon is administered by the Havasupai tribe and lies outside the boundary and jurisdiction of Grand Canyon National Park. The NPS also notes that some areas in Havasu Canyon are currently off-limits to visitors due to flood damage, ongoing repair work, or unstable ground, and says immediate closure of the canyon is possible depending on conditions. That is a real restricted space inside the larger canyon country. and it matters because people often blur together different categories of access. Tribal land is not a secret zone. It is land under tribal administration. Repair closures are not evidence of hidden ruins. They are what happens when flood damage and unstable ground make access unsafe. But from a distance, especially online, all of this can collapse into a single fuzzy impression that the canyon contains many areas where ordinary visitors are told no. And that impression, though incomplete, is not entirely wrong. The canyon does contain places where no is the correct answer. Airspace adds another piece to the puzzle. People who like the Forbidden Zone language often talk as though the sky over the canyon is somehow suspiciously controlled, and the truth is that it really is tightly regulated, though again for reasons more ordinary than the legend would like. FAA and NPS materials show that the Grand Canyon area has a special flight rules area affecting aircraft operations below 14,500 feet MSL, and the FAA's Grand Canyon VFR chart shows 5 flight-free zones where all aircraft operations are prohibited below 14,500 feet MSL. The background for these restrictions is not hidden archaeology. It is aviation safety and natural quiet. The NPS and FAA environmental materials explain that the 1987 overflights framework and later rules were designed to reduce aircraft noise, protect public health and safety, and restore the canyon's natural quiet. That is a very different story from they blocked the airspace so nobody could see the cave, but you can also see why the myth likes to borrow the fact of flight restrictions. Flight-free zone is just the sort of phrase that sounds dramatic when lifted out of context. In context, it is about noise, safety, and visitor experience. Out of context, it sounds like the beginning of a thriller. The same is true of drones. Grand Canyon National Park does not allow recreational use of uncrewed aircraft by the public, and the National Park Service says the ban exists because of safety concerns, nuisance issues, and wildlife impacts. NPS guidance notes that drones have been lost over the edge of the Grand Canyon and that violations can be enforced by park rangers. Again, nothing here suggests a hidden archaeological cover-up. What it does suggest is a landscape where visitors cannot simply send any machine they want into any airspace they want for any reason they want. That reinforces the emotional shape of the place. The canyon is heavily viewed, endlessly photographed and world famous, yet much of it is not casually explorable from the air or from the ground. You may stand on the rim and feel that everything is visible, while the rules quietly remind you that visibility is not the same thing as access. You can look down almost anywhere. You cannot legally go almost anywhere. The canyon also feels untouchable because it is physically larger than many people know how to think about. Park operations pages and trail guidance emphasize closures, permit needs, backcountry planning, water issues, heat risk, and current conditions. As of March 12, 2026, the park notes that the North Rim is being prepared for an adaptive seasonal reopening after the Dragon Bravo fire, with some facilities and trails still affected. That is a current reminder that Grand Canyon access is not only regulated in the abstract, it changes with weather, fire, erosion, water availability, infrastructure damage, and public health concerns. In other words, the canyon is not a museum hall with fixed opening hours. It is a live environment that regularly tells planners and visitors alike, not today. Places that close for practical reasons often feel more mysterious than places that are always open, because their availability seems to depend on forces the ordinary visitor does not control. And stories love that. Stories thrive where access feels conditional. Another reason the canyon gives off this guarded feeling is that even where the public is allowed to go, the rules are asking for restraint. The archaeology etiquette policy tells visitors not to camp in archaeological sites, not to walk on walls, not to disturb fragile slopes, and to understand that seemingly flat and convenient camps near water may have been used for centuries and may contain documented sites. The Vanishing Treasures page explains that architecture in the canyon is exposed and vulnerable, and can be damaged by visitation. Put simply, the canyon is full of places where the correct behaviour is not. Go explore freely, but move carefully, no less than you think you know, and do not treat every old stone as if it were yours to inspect. That culture of caution is exactly the opposite of treasure hunter energy, and that is another reason the old cave story catches. It offers the fantasy that there is still a place in the canyon where the ordinary rules stop and the great discovery begins. Real management says the opposite. The more important a place is, the more rules it often has. There is a social side to this too. Many visitors encounter the Grand Canyon through overlooks, shuttle routes, popular trails, ranger talks, and marked corridors. That experience is spectacular, but it is also curated. The deeper layers of the canyon, both literally and administratively, are not presented as an unrestricted playground. River trips require permits. Overnight backcountry itineraries require permits. Havasu Canyon access is governed through tribal systems and can be cut off by damage or instability. Caves are closed to the public. Certain sites are sensitive enough that official policy stresses etiquette and non-disclosure concerns. Aircraft operations are shaped by special rules. Recreational drones are not allowed. All of this creates an honest impression that much of the Grand Canyon exists behind one kind of gate or another. The mistake comes when people assume every gate must protect a secret. More often it protects a resource, a route, a community, a habitat, or a visitor from making one confident mistake too many. Still, I do not think it is foolish that the canyon feels different from many other parks. It does. Even the official language sometimes carries a certain firmness that can sound almost old-fashioned. Illegal. Permit required. Closed to public visitation. Research only. Off-limits. Fragile resource. Flight-free zone. Jurisdiction of the tribe. Backcountry information centre. These are practical phrases, but stacked together they build a mood. The place is telling you it has boundaries. That mood becomes even stronger because the Grand Canyon is not only famous, it is visually deceptive. You can stand at the rim and see mesas, temples, towers, buttes, alcoves and side canyons that look almost reachable in the clean, dry air even when they are not. The ice is maybe. The rules say no. Between those two voices, legends find comfortable housing. And this is where the phrase Forbidden Zone becomes useful, not as an official label, but as a description of a feeling people impose on the canyon when they notice how much of it resists casual ownership. There are real caves the public cannot enter, real archaeological places that are too fragile for careless visitation, real tribal lands outside park jurisdiction, real airspace rules, real flight-free zones, real permit systems, real closures due to fire, flood, erosion, and unstable ground. Real cliff openings that are nearly inaccessible even before the law enters the conversation. If a person wanted to build a legend around a landscape that already feels partially withheld, they could do much worse than the Grand Canyon. It is a place where ordinary management often looks dramatic from the outside, and drama is a greedy interpreter. But the stronger truth, I think, is simpler. So much of the canyon feels closed, protected, and untouchable because it contains things that cannot survive unlimited touching. Rock formations can be vandalized in ways that are irreversible. Cave ecosystems can be disturbed. Archaeological sites can be trampled, looted, or eroded. Tribal communities have their own authority and their own reasons for controlling access. Noise can damage the very experience a park exists to protect. Routes can become deadly under heat, fire, or flood conditions. The canyon is not being withheld because it is emptying its secrets into some warehouse. It is being managed because it is already full of geology, fossils, architecture, ancestry, wildlife, unstable ground, and the long consequences of human impatience. And because it is so full, it creates the perfect setting for the next problem in our story, which is that once a legend is built in such a place, the lack of evidence can start to sound almost natural, as if the canyon itself were doing the hiding, and that is exactly where the trail bends next. toward the missing cave, the missing artifacts, and the strangely durable absence at the centre of the whole tale. At the centre of this whole story there is a very simple problem, and it is one that gets harder, not easier, the longer you look at it. Nothing stable can be put on the table. No one can produce the cave with confidence. No one can produce the artifacts. No one can produce a trustworthy excavation record. No one can produce a Smithsonian catalogue entry tied to the supposed finds. Even the men named in the article seem to dissolve when researchers go looking for them. That is why this part of the legend matters so much. A mystery can survive one missing piece. It has a much harder time surviving when nearly every important piece is missing at once. The 1909 Arizona Gazette article gave readers a discoverer, a professor, a location, a huge underground complex, and an astonishing collection of relics. But later checks by the Smithsonian, librarians, historians, and journalists have found no verifiable institutional trail to match the story. The first missing thing is the cave itself, which sounds obvious until you notice how much of the legend depends on people not dwelling on that fact. The original article did not give a modern practical site report. It said the place was 42 miles up the Colorado from El Tovar Crystal Canyon and about 2,000 feet above the river, with steps leading down from the entrance. That sounds specific at first glance, but later writers have struggled with what that description even points to on the ground. Don Lago's historical analysis notes that later, theorists treated the Egyptian names section as a clue and argued over whether the site had to be near formations like Isis Temple, while others leaned on the 40 miles upstream phrasing and still could not settle the matter. A location that cannot be confidently refound is not a very healthy foundation for a discovery that supposedly changed history. That problem is made worse by the fact that the canyon is full of real caves, many of them genuinely inaccessible. The National Park Service says Grand Canyon may contain as many as 2,500 caves, with several hundred documented, and that most cave openings in the Redwall limestone are nearly inaccessible because they occur on vertical cliffs. It also says all caves in the park are closed to public visitation except for research purposes. That means the landscape gives the legend a kind of shelter. It is easy to say, perhaps the cave is still there but unreachable, because the canyon really does contain high cliff caves that ordinary visitors cannot enter, but that same fact cuts both ways. Real inaccessible caves explain why a story like this feels plausible. They do not count as evidence that this specific cave ever existed. The second missing thing is the finds themselves. This is where the story becomes especially fragile. The article described a whole world underground, hundreds of rooms, hieroglyphs, mummies, inscribed tablets, gold urns and cups, pottery, weapons, copper instruments, cement granaries, and even a 700-foot dining hall with utensils still in place. That is not a small claim. It is not even a medium-sized claim. It is the sort of claim that should leave a debris field of evidence even if the cave entrance were later lost. If material of that scale had been removed, studied, or circulated, we would expect photographs, inventory lists, letters, publications, newspaper follow-ups, internal records, or physical objects with a traceable chain of custody. Instead, the story offers something much thinner. A dramatic front-page article, and then a long echo. As an inference from the size of the claim and the lack of subsequent documentation, the absence is not a minor gap. It is the main feature. This is why the Smithsonian's denial matters so much. Smithsonian Magazine says the institution has no record of the expedition described in the article, and lists the whole thing among its most persistent myths. Discover reports the same basic result, quoting a Smithsonian response that its Department of Anthropology searched its files without finding any mention of Professor Jordan Kincaid or a lost Egyptian civilization in Arizona. Those are not hedged answers. They do not say the records are fragmentary or that the institution is unsure. They say the institutional paper trail the story implies is not there. Once that becomes clear, the burden shifts heavily back onto the original article, and the original article cannot carry much weight by itself. Then we reach the men, and the men are a problem all their own. The Gazette story named G.E. Kincaid as the discoverer and Professor Essa Jordan as the Smithsonian figure attached to the find. That is exactly what a story needs if it wants to sound secure. Names make a tale feel anchored. But Discover says there is no record of the existence of either Kincaid or Jordan in the way the article would suggest, and Smithsonian magazine says it is doubtful Kincaid even existed as presented. That does not necessarily mean there was never a real man somewhere with a similar name. It means the dramatic personalities the article relied on do not materialise in the historical record the way they should if they had truly led one of the most important expeditions in American archaeology. The people in the story behave like scenery. They are vivid in print and faint almost everywhere else. There is an especially telling wrinkle here. Discover notes that the Arizona Gazette had published an earlier piece in March 1909 about an earlier part of Kincaid's adventure, but that earlier coverage did not mention Egyptian artifacts or the cave itself. That does not prove fraud by itself, but it does show how oddly the larger story arrives. The cave is not slowly introduced through a trail of reports, notes, and follow-up coverage. It seems to spring into being already swollen with importance. In one moment the man is on an adventure. In the next, he's attached to a discovery so large it should have transformed the historical record. That jump feels less like the development of a real investigation and more like the sudden entrance of a better headline. The third missing thing is corroboration. If the Gazette had truly stumbled onto news of a major Smithsonian-backed expedition to an Egyptian-style underground complex in Arizona, other papers should have gone wild with it. Don Lago's 2009 analysis makes exactly this point. He says the story should have been huge news for Arizona, yet after examining more than a dozen newspapers from the time, he found that the Gazette article was almost totally ignored. Only one paper, the Jerome Mining News, reprinted it without comment. One other paper, the Coconino Sun of Flagstaff, did comment, and its comment was devastating. Looks like a Mulhattan story. That is not what a real breakthrough looks like in the press. It looks much more like a suspicious story entering a newspaper culture already familiar with sensational fabrication. The Coconino Sun reaction is one of the sharpest pieces of missing evidence in the whole affair, because it shows that the weakness was not discovered only by modern debunkers. Some contemporaries already smelled trouble. Lago explains that Joe Mulhattan was a famously plausible hoaxer whose specialty included outlandish cave discoveries full of ancient artifacts. He quotes older warnings that Mulhattan's business was to invent marvellous stories or lies, including repeated tales of big caves, ancient remains, and ridiculous hidden wonders. In other words, when the Coconino Sun called the Gazette article a Mulhattan story, it was not being poetic. It was placing the cave report into a recognised genre of fabricated marvels. So even in 1909, the legend had a problem. It did not enter the world as settled news. It entered the world with one local paper already pointing at it and saying, in effect, this looks like one of those. There is another absence that people often overlook because it sounds almost too practical to be dramatic. But practical questions are frequently the most destructive ones. How exactly were the supposed finds handled? If there were mummies on hewn shelves, gold vessels, inscribed tablets, tools and weapons inside a difficult cliff cave, who packed them? Who transported them? Who guarded them? Where were they stored first? What route did they take out of the canyon? Who signed for them? Who cleaned them? Who sketched them? Who catalogued them? None of those questions receives a satisfying answer, because the story never built the infrastructure those answers would require. Discover quotes Haley Johnson of the Grand Canyon Historical Society, emphasizing just how inaccessible many canyon caves are, and how implausible it would have been to haul large amounts of material from such a place. That logistical emptiness is not a side issue. It is one more reason no one can produce the finds again. The story skipped the hard part. And if the objects had not been moved, that would create a different expectation. Then someone should have refound them. A cave holding hundreds of rooms, shelves of mummies, and quantities of distinctive relics is not a subtle sight once discovered. It is not a single bead or a half-buried shard. It is an entire underground complex. Yet no accepted archaeological expedition has stepped forward and said, "Here it is again." No Smithsonian team, no park archaeology announcement, no museum release, no verified academic paper relocating the site and documenting what remained. The physical world has had more than a century to rescue the story, and it has not done so. That is why the missing cave matters even more than the missing paperwork. One can imagine archives losing things. It is harder to imagine an underground citadel of the size described disappearing so completely that only a single old newspaper article seems to know how to find it. The article's own form makes this worse. Discover describes it as an anonymous story, and Smithsonian Magazine notes that the report came from only one newspaper. In other words, the source at the bottom of everything is both solitary and weakly rooted. It is not a named archaeologist's field report, not a published Smithsonian bulletin, not a regional consensus story, not a chain of documentation. It is one anonymous newspaper account printed in an era of yellow journalism, then later revived by writers and broadcasters who preferred the wonder of the claim to the discipline of checking it. Once you see that structure clearly, the missing evidence stops looking accidental and starts looking built in. The article was never standing on a broad base. It was standing on itself. It also matters that the canyon is not some blank historical space, waiting for an imported mystery to give it meaning. Discover's archaeological overview of the canyon notes evidence of human presence going back at least 12,000 years, with artifacts from Clovis, Archaic, Basket Maker, Ancestral Puebloan, and later indigenous contexts. That means real archaeology in the region does exist, and it exists through material evidence, context, and repeated study. The contrast is useful. Real Grand Canyon archaeology leaves layers, sites, fieldwork, preservation concerns, and cultural continuity. The Gazette Cave leaves a clipping. That is not an argument from silence alone. It is a comparison between two very different evidentiary behaviours. One record grows when studied, the other evaporates when checked. T of the legend's survival comes from turning all of these absences into features instead of flaws. The cave cannot be found again because it was sealed, hidden, dynamited, or placed in a restricted zone. The artifacts cannot be shown because they were confiscated, buried in archives, or destroyed. The records cannot be located because the institution removed them. The men cannot be traced because aliases were used or files were scrubbed. Once a story starts making that move, it becomes harder to kill, because every missing piece gets recoded as proof of concealment. Don Lago traces exactly this process in later retellings, where claims grow to include sealed entrances, closed airspace, blocked hiking zones, and ever more elaborate cover-up narratives. But there is a cost to that strategy. The more the story explains absence through conspiracy, the less it can explain why no positive, independently verifiable evidence ever turns up to compensate for the missing official material. T is why the real canyon closures are so tempting to believers, and so unhelpful as proof. Yes, the caves are closed to public visitation. Yes, many lie on vertical cliffs. Yes, the park protects fragile archaeological and geological resources. But those are park-wide management realities, not evidence for one specific Egyptian-style cave complex. The National Park Service closes caves because they are fragile, scientifically important and vulnerable, not because the 1909 Gazette article has somehow been quietly vindicated by policy. Real closures explain why the canyon feels secretive. They do not supply the missing artifacts, missing records, or missing men. Re is a quieter problem too, and it has to do with scale. The Gazette article did not describe a marginal or ambiguous site. It described something enormous, hundreds of rooms, a giant hall, enough space for tens of thousands of people, and a collection of old-world-looking relics dramatic enough to rewrite history. A claim that large should be easier to verify after the fact, not harder. Small finds can disappear into uncertainty. A whole underground citadel should leave scars on the record. This is an inference, but it is a strong one. The greater the claimed discovery, the less believable total disappearance becomes. One missing artifact is unfortunate, an entire lost civilization vanishing so completely that it survives mainly as a sensational clipping is a different matter altogether. So we end up in a strange position. The story feels rich in detail, but poor in substance. It feels specific, but cannot be pinned down. It names people, but the people do not hold. It names an institution, but the institution denies it. It names a place, but the place is not refound. It lists relics, but the relics do not surface. It describes a discovery huge enough to shake archaeology, yet the surrounding world behaves as though almost nothing happened. That mismatch is the real engine of the legend now, not evidence, but the tension between how confidently the story speaks and how little it can produce when asked to show its hands. And once you notice that, the next question becomes unavoidable, because a tale built on so much absence does not survive by evidence alone. It survives because people keep deciding what kind of absence they are looking at. The emptiness left by a hoax, or the silence left by a secret. That is the argument waiting just ahead, where the story stops being only about missing things and becomes a fight between two explanations, one ordinary and one irresistible. This is the point where the story has to make a choice, even if the people telling it do not always admit that it does. It can remain a mystery in the ordinary sense, which means an open question waiting for stronger evidence, or it can become a likely hoax, which means a colourful claim that survives mostly because people enjoy repeating it. Those two categories are not the same, and they do not carry the same burden. A real mystery gets stronger when new evidence appears. A hoax gets stronger only in the imagination, usually by turning its missing pieces into drama. The Grand Canyon cave story has now had well over a century to move from newspaper wonder into documented history, and it has not done that. The Smithsonian says it has no record of the expedition the article described, and Smithsonian Magazine now treats the entire claim as one of the institution's persistent myths. That does not mean the story loses all of its charm. It just means the charm and the evidence are living in different houses. The charm comes from the setting, which is excellent. The Grand Canyon is huge, hard to search, full of real caves, and shaped in a way that makes hidden openings feel believable. The evidence, by contrast, is thin. According to Discover, the tale can be traced to a single anonymous Arizona Gazette article from April 5th, 1909, and that article made very large claims about an underground citadel containing artifacts, hieroglyphics, and mummified remains. Discover calls the story unequivocally false and says the Smithsonian inquiry it described never took place. Once you line those two things up, the basic tension becomes clear. The place is good enough to host a mystery. The record is not good enough to support the discovery. People who prefer the mystery side of the argument usually begin with a fair point. They say the canyon is exactly the kind of place where something unusual could stay hidden for a long time. On a basic level, that is true. The National Park Service says Grand Canyon may contain as many as 2,500 caves, with several hundred documented, and that most cave openings in the Redwall limestone lie on vertical cliffs and are nearly inaccessible. It also says the caves are closed to public visitation except for research, because they are fragile and scientifically important. That is a real foundation for wonder. If you wanted a setting where rumour could survive on distance, danger and partial access, you would choose a place very much like this one. The problem is that a good setting is not the same thing as supporting proof. Real inaccessible caves explain the mood of the story, not the truth of this specific claim. The believer's second point is also understandable, even if it does not hold up very well. They say institutions deny things all the time, records go missing, archives are incomplete, and official explanations are not always the full story. That instinct does not come from nowhere. Large institutions can be wrong, slow, defensive, or messy. But the Grand Canyon cave legend asks for much more than that general suspicion can safely provide. It asks people to believe that a Smithsonian-backed expedition to one of the most important archaeological discoveries in American history left no accepted Smithsonian record, no recognised academic trail, no preserved objects with a secure chain of custody, and no rediscovered site. That is not just a missing folder problem. It is a total absence problem. The bigger the alleged discovery becomes, the harder it is to explain its complete disappearance. Then there is the article itself, which deserves to be judged not by how exciting it sounds, but by how it behaves under ordinary scrutiny. The Gazette did not publish a cautious field update. It published a fully furnished revelation. By its own account, the cave held hundreds of rooms, mummies on shelves, inscribed tablets, gold urns and cups, weapons, pottery, copper tools, granaries, and a giant dining hall. That kind of completeness is wonderful for a newspaper reader and terrible for credibility. Real archaeology usually arrives in fragments, context, and argument. The 1909 story arrived already translated into a full civilization, almost as if the cave had been excavated, interpreted and packaged for a front page before anyone had time to ask the most annoying questions. Even on style alone, it reads more like a successful piece of sensational print than like a record of fieldwork. That is one reason the hoax side of the argument has so much weight. Another is how the story was received in its own time. Don Lago's historical analysis for the Grand Canyon Historical Society says the tale should have been major news across Arizona if it were true, yet it was mostly ignored by other newspapers. Out of more than a dozen papers he checked, only one reprinted it without comment. The one paper that did comment Flagstaff's Coconino Sun ran a headline saying, "Looks like a Mulhattan story." Lago explains that this was not a mysterious insult. It was a direct reference to Joe Mulhattan, a famous inventor of plausible, entertaining fake stories, including marvellous cave tales. That matters because it tells us skepticism was not a late modern correction imposed on innocent old print. The story was already being treated as suspect by contemporaries. Once Mulhattan enters the picture, the balance shifts even further. Lago's essay traces how Mulhattan had long been known for feeding newspapers sensational discoveries and polished nonsense, and it points out stylistic similarities between his earlier cave hoaxes and the Grand Canyon piece. Among those recurring touches were elaborate underground spaces, familiar signs of antiquity, and practical modern embellishments that made the fantasy feel current. Lago even notes the detail that in older Mulhattan cave stories, wires are being constructed, while in the Grand Canyon version, wires are being strung from the entrance to all passageways. That is the sort of repeated narrative machinery historians notice when they're no longer asking, could this be true, and have started asking, what kind of lie is this? The answer, at least on the evidence we have, looks very much like a well-dressed newspaper hoax. Still, the mystery side survives, because it has one emotional advantage the hoax side can never fully take away. The canyon looks like it could hide something. That is not a silly observation. It is a plain one. The cliffs are full of shelves, alcoves and cave mouths. Access is partial. Many areas require permits, technical skill or research authorization. The park closes caves to protect fragile resources, and those closures are real. For someone already inclined toward hidden history thinking, the canyon seems to cooperate. It provides exactly the kind of physical uncertainty that lets a weak story keep breathing. A person can say, "Of course no one has found it again. Look at the place." That is emotionally persuasive, and it remains one of the legend's strongest assets, even though it does not convert absence into proof. The hoax side, though, has a much simpler advantage. It does not need a second hidden world to explain the first one. It only needs ordinary newspaper behaviour from 1909. Discover says the article was anonymous and places it in the world of yellow journalism, where hyperbolic and sensational stories were common circulation tools. It also reports that the Gazette had previously mentioned part of Kincaid's adventure in March of that same year without saying anything about Egyptian artefacts or a great cave. Then suddenly, the full miracle appears. That jump feels less like the unfolding of a real expedition and more like a paper deciding it has found the better version of the story. The hoax explanation is not glamorous, but it is efficient. It explains the single article, the weak documentation, the theatrical details, the local skepticism, and the later confusion without inventing any extra machinery. Another thing worth keeping in view is scale. The Believer's version asks us to accept not just a hidden cave, but a hidden cave of extraordinary significance. The article did not claim a few odd relics. It described something like a buried metropolis. Once a claim gets that large, the standards change. Small objects can be lost. Personal journals can disappear. A name can be misspelled. But an underground complex with hundreds of rooms, shelves of mummies, impressive artifacts, and enough space to suggest a huge population should behave differently in history. It should keep colliding with the world. Someone should re-find part of it. Some item should surface with convincing provenance. Some later expedition should stumble onto a trace robust enough to restart serious study. More than a century later, that has not happened. That is not a tiny weakness. That is the central one. The missing men do not help the mystery case either. Discover says there is no record of the existence of either Kincaid or Jordan in the way the article would suggest, and Smithsonian Magazine says it is doubtful that Kincaid existed. The Gazette even misnamed the Smithsonian as the Smithsonian Institute, which Discover flags as inaccurate. None of those details alone would destroy a solid case. Together in a case already starving for corroboration, they matter a great deal. They suggest a story that wanted the appearance of specificity more than the burden of accuracy. Names were supplied because names help readers trust a tale. The institution was supplied because institutions help readers feel the matter is already being handled by serious people. But when later readers went back looking for those serious people, the ground under them gave way. There is also the question of what kind of mystery we're really talking about. Some mysteries are evidence-rich and explanation-poor. You have the site, the objects, the records, the dates, and the material, but no final agreement on what they mean. Those are good mysteries. They deserve patience. This story is the opposite. It is explanation-rich and evidence-poor. It already has a giant explanation attached to it. Lost civilization, ancient migration, Egyptian connection, Smithsonian involvement, later suppression. What it lacks are the ordinary things that should come first. Verified objects, a confirmed site, contemporaneous documentation beyond one story, secure provenance. That is why the battle between mystery and hoax is not an even contest. The mystery side has atmosphere and possibility. The hoax side has the historical pattern of how this kind of article was produced and received. And yet it would be too easy, and probably too smug, to pretend the hoax explanation makes the story uninteresting. In one sense, it makes it more interesting, because now the object of study is not an Egyptian cave, but the human appetite for one. Why did a single 1909 article become so durable? Why did later generations revive it? Why did the Smithsonian denial not kill it? Why do people keep wanting the canyon to contain a second history beneath the first one? Those are better questions than, what if the mummies were real? Because they can actually be answered with evidence. Discover notes that the tale was revived decades later in collections of old Arizona newspaper clippings, and then again by pseudoscientific writers and media figures who treated the story as suppressed truth. In that sense, the legend became a living specimen of how modern folklore grows. One especially telling point from Discover is Haley Johnson's argument that the story also erases the real indigenous histories of the canyon. She asks, in effect, if there had been some enormous influx of Egyptian rulers and labourers into the region, would the indigenous tribes with deep historic connections to the canyon not know something of it through oral history, rock art, or landscape memory? That is not a dramatic objection, but it is a strong one. The Grand Canyon is not empty backdrop. It is a lived and storied place with long human history. The hoax explanation fits that reality much better than the lost civilization explanation, which tends to brush past local history in favour of imported spectacle. So, where does the balance land, if we are being careful and not merely theatrical? It lands, quite strongly, on invented legend rather than lost civilization. The Smithsonian says it has no record of the expedition. Discover says the story is unequivocally false. The Pima County Public Library says the tale is not true. Dan Largo's historical work shows that most contemporary newspapers ignored the story, and that the one paper that bothered to comment linked it to the Mulhattan hoax tradition. Those are not tiny nudges. Together they form a very sturdy case that the Grand Canyon cave story is best understood as a sensational 1909 newspaper fabrication that later turned into full-scale folklore. But that does not mean the battle is over in the public imagination, and that is important too. The mystery side keeps winning emotional rounds because it is visually stronger. A hoax is paper, a hidden cave is stone, a denial is a filing cabinet. A lost chamber in a canyon wall is a place you can picture. People tend to remain loyal to the thing they can picture. That is why the legend keeps going. Not because the evidence is evenly split, but because one side is dry and documented while the other side has narrow ledges, dark openings, silent rooms, and the intoxicating possibility that the map of the past is still missing a room somewhere. When a legend has scenery that good, facts often have to work harder than they should. And maybe that is the most honest place to leave this stretch of the canyon. The evidence points strongly toward hoax. The feeling points stubbornly toward mystery. Those are not the same thing, and they should not be mistaken for each other. But both help explain why the story has lasted. The newspaper gave it a spark, the canyon gave it a stage, the Smithsonian gave it institutional drama, and the missing evidence gave it room to keep changing shape. Once that happens, a legend no longer has to prove itself every generation. It only has to remain just strange enough, just inaccessible enough, and just unfinished enough that people keep passing it along, which is exactly how this tale survived long after the paper itself should have gone quiet. A story like this does not survive because it is proven. It survives because it is fitted to several very old human habits at once. We like closed places. We like old places. We like the feeling that official history may be incomplete. We like the idea that somewhere behind a wall of stone there is a second version of the past waiting for the right person to notice a crack in it. The Grand Canyon cave legend learned to live inside all of those habits. The original spark was simple enough. On April 5, 1909, the Arizona Gazette printed a front-page article claiming a vast cave in the canyon held strange relics tied to an Egyptian or Oriental origin. More than a century later, the Smithsonian says it has no record of the expedition the article described, and both Smithsonian Magazine and the Pima County Public Library now describe the story as false, even while noting that it continues to circulate and generate inquiries. That last part matters. It continues to circulate, it continues to generate inquiries. Those are the real clues now. We are no longer looking for the cave. We are looking at the mechanism that kept the cave alive in public imagination long after the evidence failed to keep pace. Pima's summary says the Smithsonian has received many inquiries over the years, and that the story is not true but continues to be repeated. Smithsonian Magazine uses an even more vivid phrase, saying the report was made by only one newspaper but continues to run amok. Those are not the words people use for a solved historical footnote that has quietly died. They are the words used for folklore that found excellent conditions and kept reproducing. One reason it survived is secrecy, or more precisely the feeling of secrecy. The Grand Canyon is one of those rare places where limited access is normal enough to become atmospheric. The National Park Service says all caves in the park are currently closed to visitation except for research purposes. It also says Grand Canyon caves are fragile environments, that vandalism can cause irreversible damage, and that many caves matter to hydrology and wildlife. None of that is mysterious in the dramatic sense. It is ordinary resource protection. But ordinary resource protection can look very dramatic from a distance, especially when attached to a legend that already says something extraordinary was once hidden in the rock. A closed cave does not prove a hidden civilization. What it does do is train the imagination to think in terms of withheld interiors. The canyon's physical form helps just as much. The National Park Service says the park may contain as many as 2,500 caves, that several hundred have been documented, and that most openings in the Redwall limestone are nearly inaccessible because they occur on vertical cliffs. That is almost unfairly good terrain for a legend. It gives the story a permanent excuse. Why can no one show the cave again? Because the canyon is enormous. Because the opening is on a cliff. Because most people cannot reach such places. Because many caves are closed. Because shadows, ledges and bad footing give absence a natural home. The landscape does not verify the legend, but it protects the feeling that verification might always be one difficult climb away. Another reason the story survived is that it attached itself to a real American hunger for ancient America, by which I do not mean the real deep history of the continent alone, but the recurring modern desire to find something in North America that feels world-shaking, hidden, and somehow left out of standard narratives. The irony is that Grand Canyon already has deep and astonishing human history. The National Park Service says the oldest human artifacts found in the park are nearly 12,000 years old, that the park has recorded more than 4,300 archaeological resources, and that its 11 traditionally associated tribes view management of those resources as preservation of their heritage. In other words, ancient America is already there. It is not a blank map waiting for Egyptian material to make it interesting. But legends often survive by skipping past the real depth of a place and importing a more sensational one. That imported sensation had a ready-made visual language. Egypt means mummies, writing, chambers, hidden rooms, old authority, dead kings and museum lighting. You do not have to explain much. The word does the work. The 1909 article understood that. It did not merely say an unfamiliar culture or unexpected remains. It moved directly toward Egypt and the Orient, then added a Buddha-like figure for extra reach. That was clever in a newspaper sense because it made the site instantly legible to readers. The objects sounded famous before they sounded credible. The result was a legend that could be retold in one sentence: Egyptian cave in the Grand Canyon. That is catchy in a way that regional archaeological anomaly of uncertain affiliation never will be. The canyon's own place names gave the legend extra oxygen. The National Park Service explains that Grand Canyon's many named features were often labelled by Euro-American map makers, and that Clarence Dutton preferred to project names from world literature and religion onto the terrain. The same page quotes Frederick Dellenbaugh objecting to this Oriental and Egyptian nomenclature. NPS pages for overlooks like Mojave Point still describe visible formations with names like Horus, Osiris, the Tower of Ra, and Isis Temple. None of those names are evidence of Egyptian settlement. They are evidence of 19th century naming habits. But once those names sit on official maps and signs, they give the myth an accidental trail of breadcrumbs. A person already half inclined to believe the cave story can look at Isis Temple and think a clue has survived in plain sight. That is not good evidence. It is excellent folklore fuel. Then there is the Smithsonian effect. A hoax tied to a nameless institution fades more quickly. A hoax tied to the Smithsonian grows teeth. Smithsonian Magazine says the Grand Canyon story is one of its persistent myths, and Pima notes that the institution has received many inquiries about it over the years. That tells you the name never stopped doing work. In 1909 it gave the article authority. Later, when the Smithsonian denied the claim and said it had no record of any such expedition, the same name helped the myth evolve from odd story into cover-up story. For people inclined to distrust institutions, the denial did not end the tale. It made the tale more dramatic. A museum became not just the supposed sponsor of the discovery, but also the imagined keeper of its silence. A story also survives when it flatters the listener. This one does that very well. It offers a quiet but powerful emotional reward. Perhaps you are clever enough to notice what official history ignored. Perhaps you're standing a step outside the approved version of the past. Perhaps the experts missed something, buried something, or organised the facts too neatly. That appeal is especially strong in stories that come wrapped in print, because the original article gives the listener an object to point to. It is not just some rumour online. It is a real old newspaper. That matters psychologically, even if the article is false. Age makes claims feel seasoned. A front-page clipping from 1909 has a way of looking sturdier than it is. It feels inherited. And inherited myths often survive longer than brand new ones, because they arrive already carrying the dignity of paper, date, and typography. The legend also endures because it solves a storytelling problem many people barely notice. It gives the American landscape a hidden backroom. The Grand Canyon is already overwhelmingly visible. Millions of people see it. It is photographed, mapped, studied, and toured. But a place can be famous in the open and still invite fantasies of a sealed interior. Hidden history stories offer that inward turn. They say, in effect, yes, everyone knows the view, but almost no one knows what is behind the wall. That structure is satisfying because it lets a person feel they are moving from tourism into initiation. The canyon becomes not just scenery but threshold. Once a legend gives a landscape a threshold, it becomes very hard to strip that sensation away. Real archaeology, ironically, helped the myth too. The National Park Service says Grand Canyon contains thousands of archaeological resources and a long sequence of human occupation. It also says the canyon remains a sacred place for the 11 associated tribes, and that for groups including the Havasupai, Wallapai, Hopi and Zuni, the land is tied to ancestry, ceremony and origin traditions. That means the canyon is not merely geologically impressive, it is historically and culturally dense. Legends thrive in places where the ground already feels inhabited by memory. The cave story could borrow that gravity without earning it. It could stand near a real archive of human depth and pretend that its own unsupported claims were part of the same continuum. This is one of the reasons such stories can feel persuasive to people who do not know the local history well. The place really is ancient. The myth simply tries to redirect that ancientness. There is also a more uncomfortable reason it survived. Imported hidden history stories often appeal because they seem more glamorous to modern audiences than the real histories they displace. Egypt gets treated as global, monumental and prestigious. Indigenous North American history is too often treated by the public as a local background, which is both unfair and historically shallow. So a false claim about Egyptian ruins in the canyon can sometimes gain traction, not because it has better evidence, but because it activates a hierarchy of fascination. The foreign and spectacular gets elevated over the local and real. The Grand Canyon cave myth benefits from that bias. It asks people to be more excited by the fantasy of old-world intruders than by the actual 12,000-year record of human presence and the living cultural ties of the tribes associated with the canyon. The myth survives, partly because imported grandeur still sells. The canyon's status as a sacred place creates another layer. The MP Sacred Canyon page explains that for the Havasupai, Wallapai, Yavapai Apache Nation, and the rest of the 11 associated tribes, the Grand Canyon is sacred, and that for some tribes it is tied to origin stories. Sacred places often attract two opposite responses from outsiders. One response is respect and caution. The other is the assumption that sacredness must imply hidden chambers, buried knowledge, or guarded secrets in the cinematic sense. Those are not the same thing, but they often get blurred in popular imagination. When a place is described as sacred, some listeners hear important and relational. Others hear mysterious and concealed. The cave story benefits from that slippage. It turns reverence into suspense. And then there is the simple arithmetic of repetition. The story did not need to be true in order to survive. It only needed to be memorable enough to be told again whenever the right ingredients were present. A conversation about strange American archaeology, a photograph of a Grand Canyon cliff, an old clipping shared online, a discussion about whether the Smithsonian hides things, a travel piece mentioning Isis Temple, a late-night documentary tone, a person who already suspects official history is tidier than reality. Under those conditions, the legend refreshes itself. Pima's entry places the tale in local and legendary, which is exactly right. At this stage, it behaves less like an unresolved excavation report and more like regional folklore with institutional seasoning. I think another reason it lasted is that it offers two pleasures that rarely come together so neatly. The first is discovery. Something astonishing was found. The second is withholding. Something astonishing was not fully shared. Discovery alone can be satisfying, but it often becomes fixed too quickly. Withholding keeps a story alive because it creates room for each new teller to add one more reason the truth stayed hidden. A sealed cave, a lost file, a quiet denial, a dangerous ledge, a closed research zone, a map name that feels like a clue. Once those elements start linking up in the mind, the legend becomes self-repairing. Every hole can be patched with secrecy. That is not good method, but it is excellent survival strategy for a myth. The official denials, oddly enough, may have prolonged the story too. Smithsonian Magazine now says plainly that the institution has no record of the expedition and that the report was only made by one newspaper. But once a legend reaches a certain temperature, correction does not always cool it. Sometimes correction gives it a new plot. They denied it becomes as emotionally useful as they found it. The denial does not disprove the myth for those already committed to it. It supplies resistance, and resistance often makes a hidden history tale feel more alive. In that sense, the story survived not despite the contradiction between article and archive, but partly because of it. A clean confirmation would end debate. A contradiction keeps it moving, so the story survived because it had perfect terrain, memorable imagery, a famous institution, accidental help from Egyptian place names, real closures that could be misread as secrecy, and a very old human desire to believe that the official map of the past still has a locked room in it. It also survived because it attached itself to a place already thick with genuine age and sacred meaning, then redirected that depth into a more marketable mystery. That does not make the legend harmless exactly, but it does make it understandable. People do not keep retelling it because the evidence improved. They keep retelling it because it satisfies a set of emotional appetites that facts alone rarely satisfy. The canyon feels older than one story. The clipping feels more official than a rumour. The closed cave feels more exciting than an open one. The denied discovery feels more dramatic than an ordinary mistake. And all of that leaves us in the right mood for the last quiet turn, where the question is no longer what the article claimed or why the legend lasted, but what this whole strange business means when the cave remains missing and the story still refuses to go completely dark. By the time we reach this point, the strangest part of the story is no longer the cave, or the article, or the missing relics, or even the people who spent decades arguing over whether any of it happened. The strangest part is what the whole thing does to the mind when the room is quiet and the day has slowed down enough for old ideas to get a little more comfortable. Because this was never only a story about a canyon. It was never only a story about a newspaper either. It was always also a story about a very human thought, and that thought goes something like this. What if something important was found once and then somehow slipped back out of public sight? What if the world is not exactly hiding its secrets, but not exactly volunteering them either? What if history, like the canyon itself, has side chambers no one put on the main trail map? That is the idea people carry away from this legend, whether they believe the story or not. Even people who reject the article completely often keep a softened version of the feeling. They may say, reasonably, that the newspaper was sensational, the details were far too convenient, the institutional trail never appeared, and the alleged discoveries behave much more like a hoax than like archaeology. All of that may be true, and I think the evidence points strongly that way. But even then, another quieter thought remains. Not necessarily that this cave was real, but that the world contains plenty of real things we miss, misunderstand, overlook, or arrive too late to see properly. A false story can still attach itself to a true human experience. We do lose things. Records do vanish. Landscapes do keep their own counsel. People do walk past openings without knowing what is just inside. And perhaps that is why the legend refuses to die. Not because the details hold up so well, but because the underlying feeling is familiar. Most of us have had some version of it in ordinary life. You hear about a place that used to exist before you knew to care. You learn that an old family story was never written down. You find out too late that someone had documents, letters, photographs, or memories that are now gone. A building comes down, a trail is closed. A person who knew the full version of something is no longer around to tell it. The scale is smaller, usually much smaller than an Egyptian cave in Arizona, but the emotional shape is the same. There was a room. Someone was in it once. You arrived after the door had already swung shut. That feeling gets stronger in a place like the Grand Canyon because the canyon itself has a way of making human certainty feel temporary. You can read about it, photograph it, hike into it, map it, and still come away with the sense that the place did not especially care whether you understood it correctly. It is too large, too layered, too indifferent to our preferred storylines. That does not make it supernatural. It just makes it honest in a way people sometimes find unsettling. A landscape like that reminds you that the world was already busy being enormous, long before any of us began trying to narrate it neatly. We like our histories arranged in labelled drawers. The canyon looks like all the drawers were tipped sideways and left in the weather for 10 million years. So when a legend says there may be a hidden chamber high in the rock, a part of the mind does not respond as a scientist first. It responds as a mammal in a story-shaped world. It thinks, yes, of course there might be. Look at the place. Look at those walls, those ledges, those shelves, those black seams in the limestone, those openings that are visible but uselessly distant. Those folds of shadow that refuse to explain themselves from the rim. A person does not need to believe in Egyptian mummies in the canyon to understand why the canyon can make impossible things feel briefly negotiable. It is built for that kind of emotional confusion. It is a place where scale itself becomes suggestive, and that is where the phrase "never meant to be seen" becomes interesting, because I do not think it has to mean what the more dramatic versions of this story want it to mean. It does not have to imply a government cover-up, a museum conspiracy, or some giant historical erasure carried out by men in stiff collars and careful silence. Sometimes things are never meant to be seen in a far less theatrical sense. Sometimes they were not made for us. Sometimes they belong to another life, another people, another time, another use. Sometimes they are hidden not by design, but by age, collapse, distance, or simple disconnection. Sometimes the world withholds things because the route is bad, the record is thin, the memory broke, or the people who understood the place were never speaking primarily to us anyway. That last thought matters more than it first appears to. One of the quiet weaknesses in the old Grand Canyon legend is that it treats the canyon almost like an empty stage waiting for a shocking imported secret to make it important. But the canyon was never empty. It was never waiting for a newspaper to give it depth. It already had depth in every sense that matters. Geological depth, of course, in those long-cut layers that make human history look like a recent habit. But also cultural depth, human depth, sacred depth, practical depth. People knew that land long before the article tried to put an Egyptian costume on it. People travelled through it, lived near it, remembered it, named it, feared parts of it, relied on parts of it, and understood in a way visitors rarely do that a place does not have to be open to be real. And perhaps that is a better quiet thought to carry into the night. Not that some forbidden cave must contain a lost civilization, but that every old landscape contains meanings that are unevenly distributed. Some meanings are on signs, some are in books, some are in archives, some are in languages many outsiders never hear, some are in stories held within families or communities, and some are in the simple physical fact that a wall of stone can remain a wall of stone for so long that entire generations of interpretation come and go like weather. The canyon does not owe complete legibility to everyone who stands in front of it. In that sense, much of it was never meant to be seen in the easy tourist way. It was meant to be respected, moved through carefully, known in part and misread by the overconfident. That may sound less exciting than a hidden hall full of relics, but I think it is actually the more interesting possibility. Because once you accept that not every silence is concealment, and not every closure is a cover-up, and not every missing record points toward a buried truth, you start getting closer to the real strangeness of places like this. The real strangeness is not that they contain endless secrets in the thriller sense. It is that they contain more reality than any single story can manage. That is a very different kind of mystery. It does not invite you to solve everything. It invites you to notice your own scale, and that, whether we admit it or not, is one of the things people are often looking for when they follow legends into the dark. Not proof, exactly. Scale. Relief. A break from the modern habit of thinking everything important should already be indexed, scanned, summarized, and available after 12 seconds of searching. A cave legend offers the opposite. It says there may still be rooms no one has tagged correctly. There may still be spaces where certainty is clumsy. There may still be places where history does not line up on command like polite little folders. Even when the legend itself is false, the longing underneath it can be very real. People want there to be more past, more depth, more texture, more than the neat official version, more than the quick explanation, more than the souvenir shop and the overlook and the familiar caption under the photograph. You can understand that longing without surrendering your judgment to it. That is probably the most balanced place to end up with this story. You do not have to believe the Arizona Gazette. You do not have to believe the Smithsonian destroyed evidence, or that a giant underground complex full of exotic relics was quietly erased from the American historical record. You can look at the available evidence, decide the tale behaves like a hoax, and still understand why the hoax found such fertile ground. It found a landscape built for partial knowledge. It found an audience inclined to trust old print. It found people who like the idea that history still has trapdoors. It found a place whose real closures could be mistaken for dramatic secrecy. And it found, perhaps most of all, a human weakness for the sentence. What if they found something and we were not supposed to know? That sentence has remarkable survival skills. It works in archaeology, in politics, in family stories, in lost manuscripts, in old houses, and in almost any place where documentation thins out and imagination steps in with its coat already on. It is one of the mind's favourite little engines. It can carry very weak evidence a surprisingly long distance, but it can also reveal something tender. People say, what if we were not supposed to know? And sometimes what they really mean is, what if the world is still larger than our current explanations? Those are not identical ideas. but they often travel together. One is suspicion, the other is humility. The first can make you gullible, the second can make you wiser. So maybe the useful version of the legend, the one worth keeping after the louder claims are set down, is not about Egyptian caves at all. Maybe it is about how we behave around the edge of uncertainty. Some people rush to fill it with certainty of a new kind, hidden empire, cover-up, forbidden archive, problem solved, just in a more exciting direction. Other people slam the door too quickly and treat every unresolved question as a nuisance. Nothing there. Move along, mystery finished. Please continue consuming approved facts in an orderly fashion. Neither response is especially satisfying. The first overreaches, the second underfeels. A quieter response would be something like this. The article is almost certainly not telling the truth about the cave it described. The legend grew because it attached itself to a place that genuinely feels withheld in places, and the longing that kept the legend alive tells us something real about people, even if it tells us very little that is reliable about the cave itself. There is also something calming in admitting that not every locked door hides a treasure, and not every hidden thing is meant for dramatic revelation. Some doors are locked because what is behind them is fragile. Some places are closed because too many hands would ruin them. Some gaps in the record are not clues pointing toward a master secret. They're just gaps, which is one of history's least glamorous but most common features. We're used to stories where the final act opens the chamber, reveals the relic, names the culprit, and lets everyone walk away feeling nicely complete. Real life is much less interested in providing that service. Sometimes the chamber was invented, sometimes the relic never existed, sometimes the culprit is a journalist with a circulation problem and a flair for atmosphere, and sometimes, after all the noise, what remains is not revelation but perspective. That perspective can still be worth something before sleep. Because a story like this, even when stripped of its grandest claims, leaves behind a useful reminder. The world contains more than you can check in one lifetime, more stories than you can verify, more landscapes than you can fully know, more old paper than you can trust, more silence than you can comfortably explain. That is not a threat. It is just the shape of things. You do not need every mystery to be true in order to feel the size of the unknown. Sometimes one obviously overgrown story is enough to point toward a quieter truth, which is that people have always lived among partial knowledge and probably always will, and maybe that is why the image of the cave remains, even after the article weakens, even after the records fail, even after the institutions deny it. The image remains because it is useful. A dark opening in a canyon wall, something beyond it that may not be what the rumour promised, but is still not fully visible from where you are standing. That is a decent picture of history itself, actually. Not an empty tunnel leading straight to the answer, but a rough opening in a very large wall, with just enough cool air coming from it to remind you there is always more space behind the surface than first appears. So tonight, as you let the whole strange story settle, maybe do not ask whether the forbidden caves held Egyptian relics, or lost kings, or shelves of mummies waiting in the dark. The evidence is too poor for that to be a restful question. Ask something smaller and steadier instead. Why do people keep needing hidden rooms in the past? Why do closed places feel fuller than open ones? Why does an old clipping still have enough force to make the canyon seem more secretive than it already is? Why is it so hard to accept that some places are simply bigger than our preferred explanation of them? The canyon will still be there tomorrow, keeping its actual caves, its real ledges, its fragile sites, its tribal histories, its weather, its cliffs, its roots, its closures, and all the ordinary reasons a person cannot go wherever curiosity points. The legend will still be there too, drifting around the edges, looking for another quiet evening and another willing mind. And somewhere between those two things, between the real canyon and the imagined one, there is probably the right amount of mystery to fall asleep with. Not enough to make you credulous, not so little that wonder dries out completely, just enough to remember that the world does not have to surrender every last room to remain worth looking at a little longer.